How's it going, everyone? Thanks for being here. I'm gonna move. I am so excited to see you all. Thanks for coming. I also want to wish the space we're in, WNYC, a happy 100th birthday. Give them a round of applause, please. They're an incredible team, and I will thank them in a moment. And I just want to welcome you all, and folks are watching online too, so let's give a round of applause for them. It's hard to watch online sometimes, so I'm glad that they're watching. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dani Nierenberg. I am co-founder and president with Bernard Pollock of Food Tank. Oh, thank you. We paid you to do that. For those of you who don't know me, Food Tank is a research and advocacy organization. We're really devoted to telling stories of hope and success in food and agriculture systems around the globe. And we do this with the aim to inspire, motivate, and ultimately activate positive transformation in how we produce and consume food. And I'm really thrilled and honored to be collaborating with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to thank Dan Rochelle, Rebecca Riley, Madeline Keating, and Yvette Cabrera for their partnership. Today's agenda is really awesome, and it couldn't have been possible without them. Please give them a round of applause. And again, WNYC, this space is incredible. I want to thank Ryan Wild and Ricardo Fernandez, James Cronway. They are awesome. They just make this all look good. They make me sound good. I'm just thrilled to be working with them. Round of applause. We also want to thank the team at Great Performances who provided the delicious lunch that you just had, especially Liz Newmark, Janelle Cruikshank, and Lauren Traeger. They put together a really delicious menu with so many sustainable and wonderful ingredients. So we're going to dive in just a minute. I want to get a few pieces of housekeeping out of the way. What you'll hear today is really fast-paced and dynamic discussions, and we do that because we want to hear it from as many experts as possible. We also want to make a great experience for the live stream audience. So if you need a break, just step out, get water, do whatever you need to do. If I need to cut people off, please understand, and forgive me later, but I just want to keep the conversations flowing and make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. I hope that everyone will share the conversation, make suggestions or critiques using the hashtag ClimateWeekNYC. We'll be checking it and interacting with you. If you have concerns that you want to email to me directly, it's just very easy at Danielle@foodtank.com, and my phone is right over there next to Bernie, my co-founder, and I'll be checking it regularly. We're here today to talk about 3 important issues. 1, building healthy soils. 2, reducing food waste. And 3, protecting pollinators from pesticides. These are also important. It's also crucial right now. Healthy soils and pollinators are the foundation for resilient food and agriculture systems that support our planet's health and the health of all of us. We really have to protect them both. And we also have to make sure that the beautiful, delicious, nourishing food farmers and farm workers produce doesn't go to waste. Today, roughly 1/3 of all food goes to waste. And this is happening while millions of people, about 730 million people are hungry. Food waste is a humanitarian crisis, it's an environmental crisis, and for me, it's a moral crisis. But thankfully, it's one that we can solve. It's been so exciting for me personally to see so many organizations like NRDC focusing more on soils, on food waste, and the role of pollinators. And also we're seeing a lot of action from research institutions, from governments and farmers organizations around the globe on these issues. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the experts that we brought together today, because all of them are really so great. They're great speakers, they're great academics, they're great writers, they're great advocates for all of these things. I want to take this moment to thank NRDC for taking the lead on these issues when so many other environmental organizations are not talking about food and agriculture in the same way. So please give NRDC a round of applause. They really deserve it. I'm in awe of them. And I'm really excited to kick off this afternoon with somebody I have admired for a long time, and that's Rebecca Riley. She is the Managing Director of Food and Agriculture and Nature with NRDC. Huge round of applause for Rebecca, please. So what I want to ask you is why these themes this week during Climate Week?
So agriculture, as you said, is an issue that is so fundamental to our economy, to rural economies. It creates the food that we eat. It's just a really basic part of our world. And yet, it has this huge outsized impact on all the things we care about at NRDC, on climate change, on biodiversity, on human health. And as you mentioned, for far too long, environmental organizations just haven't given it the focus that it deserves. But that's really starting to change, and it's changing at NRDC. This is actually a new role for me. I've worked for a long time on endangered species, on clean water, on lots of issues across the spectrum. But food and ag is something that we have newly decided to elevate because we've realized how important it is and how overlooked it has been. And so when you look at climate change, for example, and you talk about food waste, when food is wasted, it goes to the landfill, and that creates methane emissions. And for those of you who know a lot about climate, methane emissions are really, really bad. But you're also wasting every input on the way. So you're wasting fertilizer, you're wasting pesticides, you're wasting water, the fuel. And so it has this outsized impact on climate that we just don't think about.
Yeah.
And so the same thing is true of soil health. One of the things we're really starting to focus on is nitrogen, because that is a source of nitrous oxide emissions, which, again, we talk about climate, people think about CO2, but nitrous oxide is 300 times more powerful greenhouse gas. And 75% of the nitrous oxide in this country comes from agricultural emissions. And it's something we're just not paying enough attention to. And so we're starting to elevate this into the conversation. And the same thing is true of the pollinator issue. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat depends on bees for pollination. But they're dying at really high rates because we're poisoning the ecosystem with a class of pesticides, insecticides, called neonicotinoids. And we're using them in a way that isn't helping farmers. And so really our goal at NRDC is to tackle these issues, but to tackle them in a way that is smart and ensures we can still grow the food we need to feed our country and feed the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of that. Such important information. So important that you're focusing on nitrous oxide and methane because they get left out of these conversations, as you pointed out. So important. I also think, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how food and agriculture have really become a part of the climate conversation over the last 4 years. Do you feel encouraged by that? Or do you feel like maybe it's a sort of using food and ag as a scapegoat? I like to think of food and ag as the solution, but a lot of it's easier to blame farmers often.
Of course. So food and ag can be a solution, but it's not a solution yet. I do think there are really good signs, though. This past year when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which those of you who follow Congress a lot know that the IRA was the most important and biggest investment in climate change, in reducing climate change, our country has ever made. And it turns out agriculture was a huge part of that investment. The IRA put $20 billion towards climate smart agricultural practices. And that's just not the kind of thing we were talking about 5-10 years ago. So I do think there's increasing recognition, but it's definitely not enough, and we're not there yet, and so there's a lot of work to do.
There's a lot of work to do. I'm glad you and so many others are doing it. I'm wondering if you can share with the audience what you're most excited about hearing about today.
So we have such an incredible group of people here today. We've brought together scientists, public officials, my team at NRDC, who's going to tell you all about the way we're tackling some of these problems. But what I'm most excited about is to really have the engagement with all of you, because you're all here because these are issues you care about. And so I hope that you can take the time to really listen to what we're talking about, think about it, and think about what it is you can do in your role and in your life to engage on this work too.
It's so exciting. This is a really stellar lineup. NRDC has pulled together so many great people, and I'm really excited to hear from them. Rebecca, I think a lot about this idea of hopeful urgency, and I wonder if you feel optimistic. I think all of us who work on environmental and agricultural issues sometimes get stuck in the doom and gloom. How do you sort of break through that?
I think thinking about this in a solutions-oriented way is really the way forward. And we have to find solutions for the sake of farmers as well as the sake of ourselves, because climate change poses a huge risk to our system of agriculture. You know, it increases flooding, it increases drought, it increases pest pressures. And as we've reduced the health of our soil, we have overused pesticides. At the end of the day, we are driving towards an incredibly unsustainable way to grow food. But we can flip that around, and that's a win-win sort of solution. And so thinking about it in terms of these kinds of win-win solutions is the thing that still gives me hope.
Yeah, it makes you get up in the morning. I can tell from talking to you. I love that NRDC really makes this farmer-centered and people-centered. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's important?
So at the end of the day, so first of all, I should say I am from a very rural community in Illinois. So
Hello,
I grew
Monmouth.
where Danny went to college. And my dad was a John Deere dealer. It was a very agricultural-based economy. And so I know from personal experience how important agriculture and farmers and our system of agriculture is to rural economies and to our country. And so really centering that is very important to me personally. But I also think it's the way forward. We can't throw farmers under the bus here. We have to find solutions that solve the problems, but solve them in a farmer-friendly way.
Absolutely. And you know, Monmouth is such a great place to grow up in. It was a great place to go to school. I just want to thank Dr. Steve Boobin and Rebecca's mom for watching today, because I know they're out there. Rebecca, do you have a call to action to the audience?
So I think every single one of you sitting here today has a role to play, whether you are an advocate, one of our incredible partners that we work with, whether you're a funder, you're a reporter, or you're a supporter. You play a really critical role in advancing this conversation. And as we've been talking about, food and agriculture, it's so important, but we haven't quite gotten it to the center of the climate conversation, the way that fossil fuels and electric cars and all of these other issues are. And so you have a role to play to help us do that, and I'm really excited about that potential.
I am too. We all have a role to play in this. Thank you for your leadership, Rebecca. What an honor to work with you.
Thank you.
Please give her a round of applause. You can stay right there. So I think that was a perfect way to open up this afternoon, and we have a lot of really great conversations to get into. Thank you again, Rebecca. So, I'm not that tall. In this next conversation, we're going to dive deeper into the importance of healthy soils. I'm excited to turn it over to our next moderator, James Deneen, who is an environmental reporter for New Scientist. He will be joined by Timothy Bowles, the Associate Professor of Agroecology and Sustainable Agriculture Systems at the University of California, Berkeley. Gerardo Menendez, a farmer and owner of Wild Kid Acres and the CEO of the Global Alliance of Latinos in Agriculture. Dr. Danielle Rath is an agricultural soil carbon scientist at NRDC. And Sarah, thank you. And Sarah Farley is the Vice President of the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. Huge applause for them all, please. James, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here. So we're going to talk about soil, but before we get dirty, I thought I'd say some quick soil stats just to give us a sense of the importance of soil and also the scale of the problem. So, as many of you probably know, soil is the most biodiverse habitat on the planet, home to as many as 60% of all species. 1 gram of soil contains enough DNA that if you were to lay it all out in a row, it would extend around 1,000 miles. 1 gram. On carbon, by some estimates, soil currently stores as much as 9 times as much carbon as all above ground storage, and could store substantially more. And yet, this immense and slowly accumulated resource is under threat. By one estimate, 16% of soils are at risk of eroding away within just 100 years. According to the UN FAO, a third of soils are already degraded, and that could rise to 90% by 2050 without big changes. So that's the situation. But just so we're all on the same page here, I thought it would be good to start with what is soil and what makes for healthy soil?
Well, I can go ahead and jump in. So, saying what is soil really depends on who you're talking to sometimes. So you could say it's the thin skin of the earth on which all life depends. You could say it is the literal foundation of our society. If you went to grad school, probably you would say it's a mixture
how are
of
you?
minerals, gases,
Just follow me. I
water,
have to go to the restroom
organisms,
anyway.
etc. What makes soil healthy is that the main thing to think about is that it's alive, right? It's a living network, a living ecosystem. Like you said, one of the most biodiverse ones on the planet. And soil's capacity to function as that living network, to continue to support societies, plants, animals that depend on it, is really what makes healthy soil.
It seems like there might be an analogy to be made between human health and soil health.
Yeah.
When we were talking about that.
Yeah, right. So, I'm not a physician. I'll start with that. But I would argue that, our own health, if we think about it, is really a product of kind of three things, right? One thing we can't control who our parents were, what our genes are, for better or for worse, right? Sometimes we'd like to be able to change our parents. But with the environment in which we live, which sometimes we also have limited control over, and how we take care of ourselves or don't take care of ourselves, right? And soil is similar, right? It has parents, it has rocks from which it formed. It formed in a particular environment, maybe at the bottom in a valley on the side of a hill. And then there's the way that we take actions to care for it or not. And it's those actions that are really mostly impacting the life in soil most acutely, right? We're not going to change the mineral makeup of soil very much, but our actions do impact the organisms that live there, that abundant biodiverse life, and also the amount of soil organic matter, all of the product, the relics of everything that was alive in soil. Right, and so those three things together, right? That's really makes for this metaphor of health in soil that is akin to our own health.
Do you want to also?
Yeah, so as a Latino farmer and representing a lot of Latino farmers around the world, soil is not just like something that we build on and basically extract from. To us, it's actually a family member, right? Like when we sit down at the dinner table with my family, my son is here today, we discuss what it means and how we're impacting our family member, the soil, right? Like we call it tierra or just the campo, like whatever we want to call it. It's a family member to us that we have to decide on, because at the end of the day, we're not going to be prosperous at all if our foundation, like he said, is getting destroyed every single movement we make. And just by observing it alone, you're affecting it. So for us, it's a family member, and it has to do with health, has to do with prosperity, has to do with everything. It also has to do with the way that we live. So
I think that gives a great sense of what it means for soil to be healthy. Sarah, maybe you could talk about the state of the world's soil health today. What is the state of that health, and what's driving the unhealthy aspects?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest culprit is land conversion. We're taking away forests, we're taking away trees, and we're doing that for a large part to grow food. And the way we're growing food really, really impacts our soil health. So whereas many indigenous communities and groups around the world really think about the whole integrity of an ecosystem, industrialized agriculture really thinks about just getting the biggest amount of yield at whatever cost, sadly. And so what that means is we're depleting our soils of nutrients. We're applying a lot of synthetic things that could be provided through biological alternatives. So for an example, synthetic nitrogen. We're putting a lot of that on the world's soils in the name of industrial agriculture. About 50% of that is going away. It's either becoming a pollutant called nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's going into our waterways. And ultimately, this really complex and beautiful relationship between the living organisms that make soil alive, habitable for things that we grow, our own health is declining in a large part. But the positive thing is, that's one approach to agriculture. There are other approaches that have been around for thousands of years and that are being renewed and analyzed and augmented with innovation in the name of regenerative agriculture, agroecological approaches. And there what we're seeing is a real focus on building back soil health, building back biodiversity. So when we start to tweak things like using biological inputs, keeping the ground covered, maybe that's with cover crops, growing lots of things together, not just one thing, we start to see the condition of our soil health, the amount of biodiversity, and even the amount of water and the ability to withstand these really consequential weather events that are increasing because of climate change. We see it all start to turn in the other direction. So soil is almost like the canary in the coal mine if we're pursuing agriculture in a way that's really detrimental for climate and humanity, or an incredible solution to the climate challenge we have to get ourselves out of.
Sarah, or maybe Danielle, I wonder if you could just draw that link between living soils, healthy soils, and then soil loss and erosion. How is it that a living soil prevents that? Or, yeah.
Yeah, so I'd say that one of the main ways that soil is alive, one of the ways that you keep it healthy is that you have living roots in there. And so roots being able, like plants growing on there, are able to hold the soil together to prevent erosion. Adding this organic matter to soil also is like a really good way to continue to store carbon, to continue to store nitrogen, to make those nutrients available to plants. And so really, again, sort of what Gerardo said, treating the soil like family, really nurturing it and ensuring that the living part of it is taken care of helps to ensure that it stays there and we can continue to work with it moving forward.
You mentioned nitrous oxide, also carbon. I started out with that statistic on how much carbon there is in soil. There's a lot. This is Climate Week. What role does soil health have to play in limiting greenhouse gas emissions? Want to take that on?
Sure. Yeah, not only limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but also removing CO2 from the atmosphere, right? So it's both. And we have to be pursuing both of these in tandem, both limiting emissions and drawing down CO2, right? And so soil's gotten a lot of attention in the last 5 or 10 years because it is this huge amount, this huge stock of carbon in the earth. And there's been a lot of hype and a lot of deserved attention around, well, if we can increase the stock of this carbon in soil, then we can draw down a lot of CO2 and offset emissions. There is a lot of potential here. The biophysical potential is about 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. It's about 25% of all of the natural climate solution potential rests in soil. So there's a lot of potential here. And at the same time, soils are also as Sarah mentioned, the largest emitter of nitrous oxide, or N2O. And so when we can limit the amount of N2O emissions that are coming from soil, and one of the best ways to do that is to limit synthetic fertilizer inputs, then that is one of the biggest levers that we have to reduce emissions, particularly from agricultural systems. And as soils are becoming healthier, they're able to supply more nutrients, more nitrogen for plants, and allows for the reduction in these synthetic fertilizers, right? So it's both of these things together, drawing down CO2, but also reducing emissions that I think are really the climate linkage with healthy soils.
And maybe to add the adaptation side, because I think the climate space, we're talking about mitigation, climate justice, and another incredibly important dimension of this whole conversation globally, and then adaptation. And I think the adaptation side is so extraordinary. I mean, you can think of when soil is alive more like a sponge. So if you have a really kind of capable sponge, you can get a lot of moisture in it and it's gonna hold it. And what happens is our soils degrade when the rain is coming more powerfully, like these deluges. We're experiencing them in New York, we experience them in Kenya in the monsoon season. These precipitation events are getting more dramatic. So more water is falling more quickly. And so if you have soil that has a holding capacity that can retain that water, it's a very different experience for the ability of the crop, the plant, the food you're trying to grow, dying, being washed away, or withstanding this event. And that's where we're seeing the difference in regenerative agriculture with a real focus on soil health. About 70% of the samples we've seen where we're using good soil health practices for regenerative ag are withstanding extreme water precipitation events differently. And that becomes an economic cost, where one model in the Midwest looked at the cost of crop failure just with focus on soil health, living roots, and it's a decrease in payouts for lost crop of 25%. And that's significant. Those are taxpayer dollars. Those are livelihoods for farmers, all because of this adaptation capability that comes from soil health and the climate resilience and water retention dimension that comes from that.
So the climate resilience that can come from soil health, that's really interesting. Is it also right to think about soil health as something that's threatened by climate change, by more extreme precipitation, by rising temperatures? How can that impact soil health, drive soil loss?
You know, I would say that we talk about soil health like it's something separate from our own health a lot of the time, but really and truly our health is dependent on the health of the soil in the areas that we live. And I think that with climate change, we're seeing, as Sarah mentioned, more extreme weather events. We're seeing more instances of drought. We're seeing greater sort of fluctuations in, yield on croplands, and that represents a massive additional risk to farmers. Healthy soils and, a large expenditure for farmers is, again, nitrogen fertilizer. So thinking about how does healthy soil help to provide those nutrients? How does healthy soil help to balance the impacts to those farmers of climate change? I think, honestly, how does it help to improve our own health? I think the nitrogen issue is a major one. I think there's a lot of health impacts that come from nitrates that are entering the groundwater. There's a lot of climate change impacts that come from N2O entering the atmosphere. And so healthy soil is able to help attenuate those issues quite a bit.
If I could just give a farmer perspective, which is a lot more blunt, and just so you know. But our perspective is a little bit different. Like, we believe that soil is the only solution, because with a healthy soil system, you're looking at a diverse array of production, because you can't just have a healthy soil and just grow corn, right? There's no production value within the soil if you're just growing corn. So like in order to have a healthy soil, you have to think about the water that's coming onto your farm. You have to think about any sort of production that can protect yourself. Not only in terms of like the soil microbiology and like growing that, but also in terms of like any type of climate instance that would happen. So like on our farm, and most of the farms that we represent around the world, they're not just growing one thing, right? Their revenue streams are diversified. That way it's protected. So if our honey goes out, which happened to us this year because our neighbors sprayed for mosquitoes, which kills 80 hives in one day. I didn't, not that I didn't care, because that's upsetting, but like I didn't impact my revenue, right? Like I could have a healthy enough soil that I was like, okay, that's all right. Like we'll just ramp up produce production and find something that has a quicker return. So like at the end of the day, like the way our farmers see it is that like there's no way that we can mitigate climate with energy solutions unless it's some magical like nuclear energy that doesn't have waste. We even believe most of them are pretty against solar as well, because there's a life limit on that. There is no life limit on a healthy soil. You can continually build it and build it and build it and build it, and it will just become more and more and more and more and more productive. We've seen it like throughout history before humans in the Midwest and the Serengeti. Like there's 9 feet deep of topsoil for a reason, because it was just kept getting build and build and build and build. So like for us, we see the solution for climate change is our producers, right? Like the land is getting lost, but we don't want it to be lost to industrial concrete, kind of like where we are right now. But like we want it to be a building block that constantly improves.
Yeah, it strikes me when you're talking about soil as in soil health as a sort of foundation. If you're thinking about that, you can't help but think about all of the other interconnections and things that are behind soil health. I just wanted to come back to this question of carbon sequestration in soil and some of the open questions and uncertainties related to that. I know there are questions about how durably soil can store carbon, how to monitor that, how to verify that. Don't want to go too far into that, but maybe you could address some of those sort of open questions that still are out there as far as soil as a reliable carbon sequestration strategy?
Yeah, I mean, and these are important questions, right? Because if we're going to invest in incentives or policies that are meant to sequester soil carbon, we want to make sure that's paying off. And so one challenge comes down to accounting. How do we measure changes, right? Soil is heterogeneous, meaning it can be different not only from one region to another, but from one field to another, right? And so sometimes the monitoring that it takes to verify changes can be difficult, but I think there's a lot of progress being made in ways of doing that. But one of the most, I'd say one of the criticisms that has come up most acutely has been around the durability. That is, okay, well, if we increase carbon in soils, but then later on it gets lost, or have we really done anything to mitigate climate change? And I want to make a couple of points about this. One is that what we need to do is pull out enough CO2 that it gets us through this energy transition and decarbonization over the next few decades, right? And if in 40 or 50 years, some of that CO2 begins to be released from soil, I think that's okay if we can get through the middle part of this century. The other thing is that as a natural ecosystem, as part of a natural ecosystem, carbon is always going to be coming in and out of these systems, right? Carbon in soil is not just sitting there like it's in a bank account. The carbon is really, it's representing the fuel for all of the energy, for all of the life that's in soil, right? And so all of the things that soil organisms do, the cycling of nutrients that supplies nitrogen, the building of soil structure that is responsible for that water holding capacity, all of this requires energy, and it's going to require some level of using that carbon. And so there's going to be some dynamic element to it. That is, there's going to be carbon coming in and out. But the goal is that on the net is an increase and a net sort of stabilization of soil carbon, right? And this is not that different from putting forests, from afforestation, right? From thinking about carbon sequestered above ground. That carbon can also be at risk of loss from wildfires that can destroy forests. But at the end of the day, right, what we get from increasing soil carbon is not just offsetting emissions and pulling down CO2, but it's these incredible co-benefits, reductions in risk for farmers, water, nitrogen benefits, and also feedbacks to actually yields and crop production. Some of our work, some of other folks' work have shown that actually, as you increase soil carbon, there's a direct feedback to crop yields, such that as soil carbon goes up, so do crop yields, right? So this is part of this positive feedback, right? So yes, there are concerns, and many of these concerns are not unique to soil carbon, but are part of any natural climate solution. But I would argue that the multiple benefits that we get really outweigh some of these concerns.
Daniel, in the green room, you were talking about how even in, I don't know, the past 10 years, you've sort of seen a real shift where carbon used to be the sort of last thing on the list of when people talked about all the benefits of soil, and now it's the first thing and maybe even sort of dominates the rest. So we talked about soil carbon. Can you talk about some of the other things that soil does for us and for ecosystems?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the main things to think about is that when you talk about soil organic matter is really the important concept there. It's not just carbon, it's nitrogen and it's phosphorus. It's all of these elements that plants need in order to grow. And so when we increase soil organic matter, we're also increasing the capacity of soil to store all of these various nutrients that become useful over time. There are so many things that soils are able to do. You mentioned water holding capacity, drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere, filtering water before it's able to enter groundwater, surface water bodies. And really, a lot of soil's ability to do these things is dependent on the soil biological community, soil biodiversity, as well as the way in which we manage it. And so managing farms regeneratively, as you mentioned, whatever the definition for that turns out to be, eventually, is really thinking about what are we putting onto the soil? What do the crops need? How much of what we are putting on is making it to the crop? How much does that cost? How much is it costing farmers? What are the economic impacts of that? How much are we taking off, right? How do we balance nitrogen, which I'll keep talking about? How do we balance nitrogen inputs and outputs? How do we balance how much carbon is coming in and coming out? And really, I think that gets at the focus of like, how does soil continue to provide all of these benefits?
The last 5 minutes, I just want to go around the horn and get an answer from each of you as far as what is the biggest thing that we can do now to improve soil health, from policy changes, new technology, reforms to farming. What do you see as the biggest step? Maybe, Sarah, you could start.
Yeah, I do think this, though it is a term with many definitions, we've actually, through a big network that Rockefeller has been supporting called Regen 10, we've now documented over 150 definitions of regenerative. So you don't need to define it, guys. It's been defined many times. What needs to happen, though, is we need to create a harmonized definition that brings all the brilliance around those many instruments and measurement approaches. And actually, that is what Regen 10 has been trying to do, analyzing all of those 150 with a group of farmers, indigenous communities, business, and science. So there's a very heterogeneous table to say, okay, pulling all that together, what is this? What can it be? And how does it first and foremost serve producers? What do producers want this thing called regenerative to do? And if I were to summarize this construct of regen ag to then offer an answer to your question, I think you could summarize all those definitions to say it is rooted in principles like ecological function, reciprocity. It is measured through outcomes, one of which predominantly is soil health, but applied through really specific practices that make sense for what you're growing, who's growing it, where they're growing it, the rainfall in that place. So it's more than just a couple practices. It could be a lot of outcomes or it could be just a couple. But I think what we need to see for the future of soil health is a very prominent focus that whatever incarnation of regenerative you want to bring to your place, your community, let the outcome of soil health be something you're measuring and critically incentivizing through policy and finance.
It comes back to your earlier point about soil health being the foundation and how you can't talk about that without talking about everything. Daniel, what's your number one?
I'd say, honestly, the investments made in sustainable agriculture by the IRA have been actually quite helpful so far. I think we had a report come out by E2 that highlighted that there are both economic benefits to rural communities because of these investments, as well as driving farmers to invest in these sustainable techniques. I think one of the things moving forward that we need to look at is to look at soil a little bit more holistically. Carbon's super important. How does soil help us tackle the nitrogen crisis that we're facing right now with all of these impacts on human health, biodiversity, climate change, everything like that? Soil can do all of these things for us. How do we invest in ways to move farmers away from needing to add so many inputs and allowing the soil to do what it can do, which is help farmers supply those inputs and build agricultural resilience in the face of climate change?
Cool. Gerardo?
Yeah, I love the way Food Tank does these. They're so professional. I'm here to ruin that today, but it depends on how passionate I get over this answer. For us at Gala, we proclaim the proclamation of regenerative agriculture, what it does for us, and really at the end of it, like Sarah said, there's a million definitions out there. So we proclaim that regenerative agriculture is the fact that we are Latino. It's within our culture to grow food. It's within our culture to cultivate the land, but also make it more prosperous, and profitable as well. But also in terms of as part of our family, we want it to live forever, right? Because I want my grandkid's grandkid to take over the farm. So when I go around these things, and it's really difficult as a farmer to walk around these rooms, just so you know. One, because nobody ever talks to me unless they see my hat. But we kind of see all these policies and regulations and scientists, no offense guys, really talking about managing farms, but nobody's ever had dirt underneath their nails, right? You don't know what it's like to sweat in climate change, right? This is concrete protecting you from what it's like out in the field. So like when we look at it as like a possible solution to this, we kind of look at it as a different way at Gala. We want people to proclaim and not chastise, but like warn people that they're being grown conventionally. It'd be very different if you went to the grocery store and bread said grown with Roundup. Would you buy it? Right? No. The fact that our producers have to proclaim and showcase that they're growing things the way nature intended is absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that anybody even accepts like an organic certification or regen ag certification, that's like insane to us, right? Like, yeah. So, you know, as a Latino, we make up 80% of the workforce in agriculture in the United States, 70% of construction. If you look at food as a whole, Latinos are the ones feeding you. And if you look at the food service industry, it's even higher percentage. So like when I come here and I'm the only brown guy that farms, it's absolutely ridiculous to see that anyone's going to even enact any change, right? I'd love to see more voice of the farmer here, more farmers, more workers. You know. And they can spike the change. They're not dumb. They know how to change the system. That stamp of like grown with Roundup, that's from a farmer. That's not from me. So that's my thing.
Tim, you want to finish this out?
Thank you, Gerardo. Yeah. Farmers like you know how to farm, and you know how to farm well. You know how to farm to protect soil health. And what we hear time and time again is that what farmers need to do that, they need land, they need markets, and they need to not be squeezed on both sides by buyers and by input suppliers. So I'm going to step us back. We need antitrust legislation to get at the extreme consolidation in the agricultural industry on both sides. We need land reform. We can't have land be a vehicle for real estate speculation, right? That's going to keep farmers off the land, right? And we need markets that value the labor of farmers and that value diversity of crops and products, whether this is public procurement, things like farm to school programs, farm to prison, farm to hospital, right? And I think I couldn't sum it up any better than Gerardo in the sense that it's recognizing that the system that we have right now took a tremendous amount of investment and a coordinated policy effort over a century to create this system, and it's working exactly like it intended to. So undoing this is going to be acting boldly and thinking boldly, and I think thinking beyond just changes in practices on an individual farm and farmer level. That's important, but we have to be thinking about this whole system and how we got here to begin with.
I like the scientists.
I think that's all we have time for, and a good place to stop. Thank you all so much. Thanks.
Bigger round of applause, please. This was amazing. And no offense to the other panelists, but Gerardo is my hero. Thank you, everyone. I have to ask you to leave the stage, y'all. Get out of here. We have stuff to do. That's fine. We have stuff to do. I'm going to sit here. I am really excited. Another round of applause for them. They were great. I'm sorry I had to kick them off. And I love this idea of we have to act and think boldly. Act and think boldly, everyone. If we take nothing else away from today, act and think boldly. So we have a very special fireside chat coming up next. And I'm really incredibly honored to sit down with Gregory Jaffe, a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Please give him a round of applause. Nice to see you, sir. And Karen Ross, I love her, the Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Please give her a round of applause. She didn't fall. She didn't fall. Thank you both so much for joining me. And I know it's such a busy climate week for you both, and I'm honored you can be here. So on this last panel, we had really great points about soil health. So I want to give you both a chance to respond to something you heard or maybe you didn't hear that you think should have been brought up. And Secretary Ross, over to you.
All right, so it was a great panel. I loved everything that everybody had to say. And I just think it's so meaningful that with intention, we're focusing on this foundation that has been able to feed us all these years, but we cannot borrow from the future. And that's why the timing of doing these kinds of conversations is so critically important. And I feel very lucky that I once worked for Secretary Vilsack at the beginning of these ideas about climate-smart agriculture, which starts with soil health and the building blocks for what that means. And so when I got back, I had this big lofty idea of being able to take that, but put it to work in California, because we have such differences, the same, but I grew up on a farm in the middle of western Nebraska, which is the middle of nowhere, and so the diversity and the microclimates and the soils. And so before we ever had incentive dollars, and we've been very fortunate in the last decade to have that, we first took the time with scientists from across agencies, an all-of-government approach, to say this is what we mean by climate-smart agriculture.
Yeah.
And it took us a while to get the funding for soil health, but we have now invested over $125 million in incentive grants, 1,500 farms. We measure it by equivalent of CO2 emission reductions. But what's also important about the funding that we've had, this is very important, it's based on voluntary practices, it's cost sharing with farmers to make these transitions, but most importantly, we focus on historically underserved farms and small farms who are most vulnerable in so many different ways, and we invest in technical assistance, community-based organizations, ag and natural resources at the cooperative extension, and we funded demonstration projects at the beginning. That ability of farmers to learn from farmers is one of the most meaningful ways of making that transition.
It really is. Gregory, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I was struck by, I heard the panel and they all made a lot of really important points there, and I was thinking about our portfolio of what we're doing at USDA, and I was sort of pleased to know that we actually are trying to solve some of those problems or provide information for some of those. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples. One was there was a discussion about how to measure this and how do we measure and verify that. And so we recently invested $300 million from the IRA that was talked about earlier to understand and measure the soil carbon, to look at greenhouse gas benefits from NRCS practices. And so, we hope that in a few years we will actually have some answers to some of those questions that were being brought there. So that was one example. And another one I just wanted to give was, there was a lot of discussion about fertilizer and how do we use fertilizer. And one of the areas that I work on, lead in the department, is the bioeconomy and bio-based products. And so another program we've had more recently is the Fertilizer Production Expansion Program at the Rural Development. And we've given a lot of funding to increase domestic production of fertilizer. But I went back into that database and looked at it from a bio-based product. So what are we doing there? And I was, pleasantly surprised to see, a rough estimate, maybe 20 or 25% of those projects are using bio-based materials, biomass, or food waste, to get to our next panel, to produce fertilizers, to produce nitrogen fertilizers. And so I think that also fits with some of the comments that were made in the panel.
No, it's so exciting. I'm especially excited about the data that's being collected and the bio-based fertilizers. It's really important. Karen, I want to turn back to you and talk about what you're seeing from farmers on the ground. What are they thinking, and what are they doing around resilient, regenerative, climate-smart farming?
Yeah, so all of our climate-smart programs are oversubscribed. We introduced our first one around irrigation practices in the heart of our first historic drought. I've now lived through two, which is why I look so old. Okay, there's a reason for this. But improving irrigation practices over the time that we are using less applied water, 14% less applied water, but we're getting 38% more productivity.
Wow.
When we improve our irrigation practices, we automatically reduce runoff, emissions, and we're still maintaining our productivity. So thinking holistically, and I think one of the most meaningful things that got talked about, but we talked about it in the green room, are the co-benefits. We should not look at all of this in a siloed kind of way. It is a system. And so the work that we're doing is a more holistic approach. And I think that's helped with our farmers, because we're not saying, you did this, get us out of this. We're saying, we want, my goal in life, every farmer, every acre has at least one climate smart ag practice. But once they do this, it starts to make a business case. If we cannot help them see not only it makes me feel good to do this, and some farmers are going to do that. It's a combination of being able to sustain a living and know that you are going to have a farm that can go forward to next generations if you're lucky enough to have children or relatives that want to do that. But I think it's also this sense of pride of doing something that has purpose. And I want to make sure that future generations, whoever they might be, wherever they are, can continue to do that. And we're seeing farmers that are oversubscribed, that a lot of our larger farms are just doing this on their own, as their own experiment to try to get to that. And at the end of the day, if it can reduce inputs and still grow healthy food that fits into markets, so our Farm to School program with $100 million in the last 4 years, all of the farmers in that program are using climate smart ag practices. So, we're trying to show a pathway in the transition that we're making.
Yeah, and I love what you said about pride and purpose in farming, and also the dignity. Farmers deserve to be dignified, to have that dignity. Greg, I'm hoping you can talk about some of what the U.S. Department of Agriculture is doing to try to help farmers grow food more sustainably and help support rural economies.
So we're doing a number of different things. I mean, I think we've mentioned some of the investments that we've had from the IRA, and one of those was the Climate Smart Commodities Program, and with $3 billion and, 125 or so different projects. And again, that was, I don't know if it was oversubscribed, but clearly we had a huge interest in there, and interest especially not just by farmers, but by private industry and public-private partnerships and, universities, everybody coming together to try to figure out this co-benefit. How do we both, move farming in the direction of being more sustainable, adapting to climate change, but also producing new income for farmers? It's really important. Secretary Vilsack, it's really important to him, it's important to the Biden administration that we keep farmers farming the land, that we keep our rural economies vibrant. And so we have to figure out ways to have additional income streams for them and to do that. And the Climate Smart program is one of the ways that we've done that. And, I can give a few examples of some of the projects that are there. I mean, there's animal ag methane reducing projects. There's over $500 million to benefit methane reductions. There are projects on genetics, there are projects on feed management, there are projects on manure management. And part of these projects is to get farmers interested in it. So you get them trying the feed additives, and once one farmer tries it and his neighbor says, oh, what are you doing? And then they, so the first farmer might have been enrolled in the program, and then you have 3 other farmers around who say, hey, I want to enroll in that program, or I just want to do that. So I think that another example was a climate-friendly rice project, which has, I think, over 30 farmers now in 4 states on 20,000 acres, where they are paying farmers incentives to use climate smart practices, and they're producing a reduced methane emissions in that rice, and the farmers are excited about it. The company that's processing that rice is excited about it, and now they're actually selling it to consumers with a label that talks about that. And hopefully consumers will be interested in buying it, and we'll have that pull from the marketplace back to all the way back to the farm and to the rural community. So I think those are some of the examples
Danny,
of how we're doing it.
Can I just add, one benefit we haven't talked enough about is the excitement this creates for the younger generation. We think a lot about next generation talent and tools, because guess what? When I sit in a coffee shop with some of my friends and we're talking about how hard it is, how hot it is, how bad the markets are, how overregulated we are, I hear that one a lot. I'm like, do you think these young kids behind you think farming is a great future to go into? But to have that sense of purpose that I can grow food and be be a climate warrior, that's exciting. And I think we have to think about how much on the edge we are about how do we attract more people into farming on a global basis, so it can be a way to feed your family and have some income and still have the next generation see that as a really viable option, whether it's on the farm or in the whole value chain of what makes farming work.
It's such an important point, and we heard this morning from a young farmer who became a farmer because she's a climate warrior. And I think that's so exciting that people are coming into this because they want to solve the climate crisis. It's a really exciting time. My next question is for both of you, and it kind of relates to what you just said, Karen. When we lose farms, we lose so much more than the food produced on those farms. We lose a whole sense of community and the businesses that support those farms. Can you both talk about that? And Greg, maybe I can turn to you first.
No, I mean, anybody who's seen the Secretary's whiteboard speech will see that, in the last 5 years, we've lost 140,000 farms, and I think it's over 500,000 farms. The acres, I can't repeat to you, but it's millions and millions of acres of farmland, and unfortunately, we don't gain that back. And so how do we keep farmers on the farm? How do we keep those rural economies vibrant? And that's been, what I've been tasked to, and pretty much everybody else in the Department of Agriculture throughout this country has been tasked to. How do we build additional income streams so that we get farmers producing the food and the nutrition security we need, but also producing other products, feed, fiber, fuel, bio-based products? How do we build income streams that allow them to stay on that farm and build those vibrant communities? And so we do that, and as I said, I sort of lead our bioeconomy effort, and it's every mission area. And so we have, our rural development is spending lots of funds trying to build bio-based products, but it's not just using biomass but we want to use biomass to produce a bio-based product, but we want to do two other things. We want to make sure that it's U.S. farmers who are growing that biomass to do that, and we want to make sure that industry that's producing that bio-based products locates within that rural community, so that those jobs go back into that community and it builds that community. And I think, we do that through our loan programs and grant programs. We're doing that with the Forest Service and the research they're doing to use our woody biomass that's out there, to use the hazardous fuel that we need to safeguard the West in a productive way, so we're not just releasing that as greenhouse gas emissions when it gets burned, either on purpose or not on purpose, but that we can actually turn that into renewable natural gas, so we can turn that into fertilizer, so we can turn that into sustainable aviation fuel. And of course, we do a lot of the research within our research arm to sort of come up with those kind of products and give that to industry, sort of a leg up, like, okay, we've learned how to take food waste and turn it into bioplastics. We're not the people who can develop that further. Can you guys do that? Is there a startup in your community that can do that? So that's what we're really trying to do.
Yeah, and it really builds those rural economies back up because they've suffered so much. Karen, do you want to
So this is heavy on my mind. I do not want to be the first Secretary of Agriculture for the great state of California when we could lose up to, some estimates, 1 million acres of farmland. For a legitimate reason, it is to bring our underground aquifers into balance, which is a huge part of and we've seen many more articles just in the recent couple of months about the threats to groundwater supplies as an important tool in a changing climate in particular. But our implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is really a forcing mechanism to think about the land is one thing that may have to be retired. How could it be repurposed? Could it be an alternate fallowing kind of thing? But if we only look at what it means for the landowner, sure, we'll turn it all into solar, which will be a lease payment once a year, or, well, I'll take part of this and we'll turn it into warehousing, which is starting to really come into our Central Valley, and housing, which eats it up, because we all know we need affordable housing. But let's do a better job of understanding community benefits and how do we measure that. It's the jobs. Not all are full-time year-round, but many are.
Right.
It's all these small businesses that provide services, seeds, all the inputs. I call agriculture a renewable resource because it's activity we do every year. So it's supporting all of those businesses on the input side, as well as we add value, like all the way to our ports with products that might go out or whatever it might be. So how do we intentionally bring the land use issues are inclusive of all the people that could be impacted, understanding that land use is a sacred local government role. And so what is the appropriate way for states and federal governments to give the signals to help do that kind of quantification. I think we tend to think about landowners, and yet in the state of California, people are shocked to hear, because we have big numbers, 70% of our farms are less than 100 acres. So how do we make sure that small farms aren't the first ones sacrificed? How do we make sure, as our previous speaker talked about, that farmers of color can thrive in addition to all this? We can't lose the equity side of that. And community benefits, for me, really do take a broader look at the equity issues.
Absolutely, I love that. In the final couple of minutes we have left, I want you both to give a call to action on food loss and waste. And Greg, I want to go to you first, because there's been so much movement in the Biden-Harris administration on this issue.
So I guess my call to action, I'll pick up the words that were used in the last one of co-benefits, but I look at it as 2-for-1s or 3-for-1s. And so, you know, we have this issue of food loss and waste, and we obviously want to reduce that. But can we also take that food loss and that waste and turn it into a bio-based product? Can we turn it into something useful? And, you know, I'll give you an example. I was out at a roundtable out in Oregon a few weeks ago, and there was a company out there that had been, you know, taking waste from fish processing and turning it into a liquid fertilizer. And they were getting additional funding from USA to now build a second facility in Texas, in the Gulf Coast, to take shrimp waste and turn it into fertilizer. And so I know everybody out here probably, you know, we all generally think about agriculture, but a lot of us have our unique issue. You might be here because you're thinking about soils, or you might be here because you're thinking about food waste, or about pesticides, or pollinators, or things like that. But the call to action to me is, how do we both solve the problem you want to solve, but at the same time get a double benefit or a triple benefit, and make agriculture more sustainable, build rural economies at the same time? Think about, how do we get those additional benefits from the one action that we're all working on?
Those win-win-wins.
Yeah.
They're
Exactly.
awesome. Karen?
So I would just say food waste is something every one of us can do something about. When you look at the waste streams and how it's utilized, sometimes on the farm, it's utilized for feed or compost or whatever it is. But food waste, a big percentage, and I know you have an upcoming panel, so this is a lead-in for Emily.
Thank you.
A big part of food waste is like, everything was beautiful at the farmer's market. I bought way too much, and then I realized I have a dinner every night of the week, and then it's slimy and green, and I don't know what it is. Like, we all have these opportunities to make these kinds of personal choices, which collectively add up. So I would say it's important to be advocates, it's important to do the policy, but it's important to also think about, this is something I can do something about, and teach the young people, our future generations who are very conscientious about that, to do something about it collectively. And then I'll send it to you for bioproducts, but whatever we do, let's keep it out of landfills because of the methane emissions, okay?
Right on.
Yes, definitely
Thank you.
out of landfill.
Thank you so much. Please give these public servants, they are public servants, a round of applause. Thank you both so much. What a delight. Thank you. Before we continue, I need to take a moment to thank some of our in-kind partners, including Arrow Farms, Appeal, Adaraya, Beans is How, Bonterra Wine, Bowery Farming, Brooklyn Brewery, Certified Origins, Flora Food Group, Farmer's Fridge, and Gotham Greens. Please give them a round of applause. You're all eating deliciousness because of them. Before we head into our next panel discussion, I'm excited to invite another public servant to the stage, Nina Shaw, who is the Director of the Resource Conservation and Sustainability Division at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Please give her a huge round of applause.
Hello, and thank you, everybody. And it's kind of a great segue from what Karen was saying, because I'll talk a little bit about methane today. So it's Climate Week, right? And with that, I'm really excited to share a few things that we're doing at EPA on food waste and how it's related to climate. So there are two facts that I think about almost on a daily basis. One is that food is the single most common material found in landfills. It's 24%. 24%, that's just an amazing figure. And then in addition to that, over 1/3 of all produced food in the United States goes uneaten. And so when I think about those two things, my job and the job of my team, I feel, is a big one. And so during my short time today, we're gonna talk a little bit about what we've been able to do in the last year or so. So in November of last year, speaking of methane and climate research, the EPA put out a report called Quantifying Methane Emissions from Landfilled Food Waste. And it showed that 58% of methane emissions released to the atmosphere from landfills are from food waste. We also learned that an estimated 61% of the methane generated from landfill food waste escaped before the methane capture system was put in place. So while total emissions of municipal solid waste landfills are decreasing, methane emissions from landfill food waste are increasing. And each year, the emissions caused by wasted food in the United States are greater than the emissions from all domestic flights within the United States, plus the international flights run by US airlines. So these are really significant factors that we now have from peer-reviewed research that have been incredibly important for our work. And it further emphasizes why preventing food waste or preventing waste from food is important in the beginning. So in addition to that, we came out with a strategy in June of 2024 with our colleagues from USDA, Greg Jaffe and his team, the FDA, as well as the White House. And it was called the National Strategy for Reducing Food Loss and Waste and Recycling Organics. It provides a tangible set of goals for federal partners, retailers, and consumers that we can all work towards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And sort of what Karen Ross said at the end, everybody has a role to play. And so this is the second in a series of circular economy strategies that we have put out. The first was on recycling. This one's on food loss and waste, and the next one will be on plastics. And each one of them is set up in a similar vein, that the number of actors that have a role here is really everybody along the life cycle. And I think the most important the next thing that I really want to talk about is that last week we announced a funding opportunity of almost $40 million to go to prevent food waste and fund the development and implementation of a national consumer education and behavior change campaign, which was identified as one of the key actions for EPA in the strategy itself. So earlier you heard about the Inflation Reduction Act funding. Well, the bipartisan infrastructure law funding was equally as important in the area of waste and food waste for EPA. This is the first, largest amount of national funding we've ever had since RCRA was passed in 1970s. Wow. So that's a really, really big deal. So this funding will go to create a customizable campaign informed by research on effective messaging for behavior change and learnings from community-level food waste prevention campaigns. And it will also increase the market for and sales of compost and increase education and outreach to households on composting. We are so excited to be able to propel the United States toward meeting the national goal to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. While prevention is best, diverting food waste from landfills is more important than ever and a significant opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And while this latest round of funding, it's the second, the first round of funding was pretty significant as well. We were able to give money to all states, territories, and the District of Columbia to look at managing waste in general in the state, as well as other recycling, education, and outreach grants. In addition to the funding for the recycling, education, and outreach, we have another round of funding for the solid waste infrastructure for recycling grants. So it's about $80 million, $20 million to tribes, and another $58 million for communities, with further funding for states to come in 2025. So the funding is really foundational for changing the conversation, getting more people to the table, and being able to address what are some of the most complex challenges that we're really dealing with in terms of waste. And while the money is time limited, we need to spend it by 2026. Our goal for this work is really to make the case for continued funding for the work in solid waste management, including food waste prevention and recycling. The last thing I want to talk about is more funding that our colleagues in the Office of Air have been working on, which is the Climate Pollution Reduction grants. I know many of you have been working on them, and NRDC has been working on them. They just announced that about 6 states got over 120 million of the 4.5 billion, which is just an amazing amount of money. But 120 million to continue to work on food waste projects, and this was in addition to 5 tribes who also received about 21 million. So all told, we have an incredible number of communities and tribes working on these issues throughout the country, and it's really incredible. And the last call to action is really the last piece of the climate pollution reduction grants is the comprehensive plans, which are due in the summer of 2025. And we just want to make sure that people continue to put robust work around waste and food waste in those. And we're not done yet. We are going to be working on updating the estimate of how much money households spend on average on food that is not eaten, which will be in our wasted food report. We're going to be doing more work on the benefits and barriers of compost, the benefits of compost use and also the barriers to it. We'll also provide a synthesis of the latest science related to contamination by plastic and PFAS in organics recycling, which is going to be really important. We're also going to provide a tool to calculate avoided methane emissions from diverting food waste from landfills, and we're going to assess the methane emissions from food waste that is being sent down the drain. In closing, I just want to say that together, we're going to keep valuable resources in use instead of in landfills. And I also just want to say that I wouldn't be able to stand before you today, and no public servant could, and really talk about what we have been able to put out and accomplish if it weren't for the work of years of many people advocating in Congress and other places for continued funding and continued focus on this work. And so I really want to call out everybody who has supported this work, and in particular, the folks on the next panel, Greg Jaffe, who is at USDA taking over for Ann Napke. USDA is an amazing supporter, obviously, but they're also a huge collaborator and important. Emily Broadleib at Harvard, who is on our EPA Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Federal Advisory Committee. Kate McKinsey, who I believe was at the announcement in 2015 between USDA and EPA, where we announced the goal to reduce food loss and waste by 30% by 2030, and then also to NRDC for their work on the Save the Food campaign, which has been such a huge driver of this effort going forward. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate being here and getting a few minutes to speak in this busy agenda, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the conference. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Thank you for all of your work. Incredible. So we're going to continue talking about food loss and waste in this next conversation, and we'll look at how momentum is being built and created at the local, state, and federal levels. So moderating this conversation is one of my favorite journalists, Dina Schenker, who is with Bloomberg. She will be joined by Kate McKenzie, the executive director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, Sophia Hossain, the Zero Waste Manager at the Baltimore City Department of Public Works, Emily Broadleib, a clinical professor of law and the founding director of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, and Madeline Keating, a senior advocate on food waste for NRDC. And I'm going to get out of the way. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you so much for having us. And let me just say that as a middle child, I love being referred to as a favorite anything. So thank you. So we are here to talk about food waste and food waste policies at federal, state, and local levels. And I actually wanted to start with a study that recently came out. Emily, of course, has read the study and is ready to talk about it in depth. So I was hoping, Emily, you could tell us a little bit about what this study found. It looked at landfill bans across the country. So tell us a little bit about what these landfill bans are and then what these researchers found.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Dina. Thank you to NRDC and Food Tank. I'm so excited. So we, in my organization, we do a lot of work really helping people understand the laws around food waste, but also the food system more broadly, and then think about policy change. So one of the ways we've been doing this in terms of food waste has been for years now tracking the evolution of policies at the federal level and like looking at what states are doing. I know this is a little bit of buildup, but one of the exciting things has been a number of states have been enacting what we've been calling food waste deterrence policies. So these include either like a ban on food going into the landfill, a tax or other penalty on excess food being wasted, donation requirements that penalize food businesses for not donating safe edible food. And it's been really incredible to see. The first state that enacted ones was really like 2012. Massachusetts, Vermont were some of the first states. And now we're seeing more than 11 states have these kinds of policies. So this study that just came out was the first one that really tried to compare across states to see what they look like. And what it found was Massachusetts, which I'm not surprised by because Massachusetts has a great policy, was extremely effective. And they saw that there was in, I think just the first, 5 years since that policy was in place, 13% reduction in food waste. And you just heard a little bit about how food waste is a huge emitter. There was a 25% reduction in emissions per ton in the landfill because the things in the landfill were no longer food, it was other things, and therefore we saw a big reduction in emissions. And it also found that states that had much weaker policies didn't see as much change, so I think it's a real call to action for us to help support states doing things like this and making sure that when they implement these, they, put teeth in them and really make sure that they're following through.
Can you give us an example of what like a weak policy is versus a good, strong one?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. So I think what we're seeing, there's these policies will vary on a couple different ways. Sometimes the weak ones will have a really high threshold. So Massachusetts is a good example. The way that the policy worked at the time the study was done was any producer that had more than a ton of food waste per week going to landfill was going to be penalized. So it was really the biggest businesses. And even since that study came out, Massachusetts has half that. And now they say if you have a half a ton of food waste going to the landfill per week, you'll be penalized. So a lot of businesses are being impacted. A weak state would be one that says, if you have 2 tons of food waste per week, are you subject to the ban? That is a lot of food being wasted. So it's only like a handful of businesses, or a number of states have exemptions from the ban if you're not within a certain number of miles of a composting or anaerobic digestion facility. And in some of those states, it's like if you're not within 10 or 15 miles of such a facility, you're not subject to the ban. Massachusetts, by contrast, said there's no exemptions. We want to force the building of more infrastructure. We want to have more composting and AD facilities, more food rescue. And they've actually seen that happen too. Not only did Massachusetts reduce food waste, but they saw an increase in donation. They saw the creation of 500 new jobs in food recovery and compost and AD. And again, this was, old data. It's probably even more now. 175 million in new revenue generated just by treating food as a resource instead of throwing it away in just 2 years of that ban.
So what do you think? Can other states model themselves on this ban and use these specifics? Is it possible to change bans that are already in place to make them more effective?
Yeah, definitely. I think, so at the time that study was done, they looked at 5 states, including Massachusetts, one of which was California, which at that time had a very weak law and had just enacted a legislation, SB 1383, which since has been implemented and is much stronger in terms of like requiring food to not go into landfill and actually requiring donation of edible food from a large number of businesses in the state. So it'd be interesting now to go back and like see what that looks like. But again, they had a policy, they realized it wasn't doing what they wanted, and they, really rallied behind doing a better job. And a number of the states that are out there have been increasing the strength of their policies over time. So I mentioned Massachusetts, like the threshold got lower. I think a lot of states have an opportunity to follow suit. And there are now 11 states that have these policies on the books and are in various steps of implementing them. But I think I mean, I would say like more resources, more funding. I think the federal government can bring in money to help support states doing this. You need to build infrastructure. You need to build the enforcement capacity. And that takes time and money. But I think we're on like a really good path. Like I'm excited about where we are, what the data is showing, and where we're going.
Great. Kate, I wanted to go to you next. For us New Yorkers, I feel like, probably a lot of people in this room follow much more closely than I do. But for me, I'm always like, what's the latest on the city's composting program? Because it feels like it changes a lot. And so I was hoping you could tell us sort of like about the evolution of, of that program, where it is now, what challenges you guys faced, what successes you saw, and what lessons there are to take away from that.
Yeah, I'd love to. So composting in the city actually started in one form in 2017. And we never really had more than about 40% of the population utilizing the programs. Of course, during the pandemic, things shut down, they started to come back, then there were these budget cuts, but the fantastic news here is that as of October 6th, every residential household in New York City will have the opportunity for curbside compost pickup. Every household. So what that means is that we already are it's interesting. I was talking with Emily and earlier with Dana Gunders, and usually New York gets out ahead of and is really proud about these things, but we already have the nation's largest organics program. We had about 170 million tons of organics captured last year. And now with the curbside compost rollout, we also have 400 smart bins around the city. And those have seen an extraordinary amount of pickup over the recent 2 or 3 years as well. And so that's a lot about the residential side of things. I want to connect a little bit to what Emily was talking about. We also, for years, have been doing a waste characterization study to really, this is an important job, to look at what we're collecting, how much what would be recyclable is actually being thrown away, how much organics is being thrown away. And what's interesting is that we have about 36% of all of our waste in New York City is organics. And then about just over 30% is recyclable. So the top line there means that 75% of the waste in New York City could be diverted from landfills. So that's our extraordinary opportunity. And so I encourage everyone, we are having education sessions because that I think is the hardest part for people to overcome. If you've been a lifelong composter, that's fantastic. Keep talking to people. If you're new to it, keep going with it. We're doing the best that we can to make it accessible by going to nyc.gov/DSNY to be able to get your brown bin. And it's a little less strict in what you are, maybe if you're composting for your backyard, what we're putting in. Certainly it's all yard waste and things like that, but you can even put meat and bones and that type of waste into your curbside composting. But then I also want to touch on schools, because this is something that I'm particularly proud of, too, as a mother of 2 public school students. And I recently learned that my daughter's a lunch monitor. And she helps people. I hope helps is the right word, to separate what should be thrown away and what isn't. But every school in the city has been trained at this point, right? So we all have been trained on many things, and whether or not we are as good at performing those actions is the great divide at times. So these are all behavior changes that we have the opportunity to practice. But I do know, and I also want to put a plug in for some of the work on the other side of my office that we're working on, which is around, I firmly believe in our schools, we will see less food waste because our food is especially delicious. And so we're really trying to make sure that by making sure that everything that we serve in school lunches and breakfast is kid approved, that kids genuinely want to eat the meals. And so that's helping to decrease food waste as well.
Got it. Great. Sophia, I'm curious what you, coming from Baltimore, when you look at, say, a city like New York, how much can you learn from city to city, and how much is like so city specific that you just have to find another way?
We take a lot of good lessons from New York, actually.
Same.
One interesting parallel is that about 75% of the waste generated in Baltimore City is also divertible in some way. So in terms of waste characterization, we're looking at something similar. We have about 100,000 tons per year generated in the residential sector of, food and yard waste. And when we think about how to divert it, like New York City, we are space limited, right? Like we can't build a 9-acre industrial composting facility in the city. And so we look at decentralized infrastructure. We look at, how can we put bins on the street where people can drop off their food waste? How can we make it convenient for people who don't drive, or, for people who are using public transportation? Or how can we utilize our urban farm network and use compost generation locally to support the food system, to support the farmers, to create the connection for people like, oh, the food waste that you put in this bin is actually being turned into compost to grow your food that you get at the farmer's market, right? It's like we have the opportunity to demonstrate how circularity actually works in a small footprint. So the other thing I love about New York is y'all are so good about, rat training. And like one of the biggest things with food waste is that there's the misunderstanding that composting or separating out your food scraps will exacerbate pest issues. And that's, I'm trying to debunk it, right? When you properly manage your wasted food, you're actually working to take away rats' food source, right? Take away those pest pressures. And so, y'all's rats are, I think I learned a lot from her. There's a lot of great parallels to draw. And just to, call on the last presenter talking about the funding opportunities from the EPA. Baltimore City received a Swiffer grant last year. And so we're going to be building the first in-city composting facility that'll be able to, at its current level of funding, process about a quarter of the food waste that's generated in the residential sector with opportunity to scale.
That's great. Yeah. Now, I also, sure. Yeah. Maddie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of what we see in food waste, which I think differentiates it from so many of the other issues in food, is that we always talk about systems change, but so much of the food waste, I think last I looked, it was like 48% comes from our homes. And I know there's been some public education campaigns around this from NRDC, but where should the focus be? Should it be on, obviously we'd like to have it everywhere, but but how much should we be focusing on what goes on in people's homes, as difficult as it is to get people to change their kitchen practices, but also knowing that that's the bulk of the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So food waste is an issue that happens across the food supply chain, from farms to manufacturing to wholesalers to retail to restaurants and to households. NRDC works at the federal, state, and local level on policy interventions and different programs that can help to tackle food waste across the food supply chain. We were talking about this. Food waste as an issue is kind of like a bunch of different issues that are the product of a supply chain that is just not as efficient as it should be. And like other environmental issues, we have an obligation to address what the root causes of that are. That said, there is a lot of food waste that's happening in our homes, and individuals can make a difference by reducing their own food waste. But we need to make it easy for them to do, and we need to make it something that is the norm. And so what I think we are dealing with as a root issue is an undervaluing of our food and a cultural component of just overconsumption without a focus on just basic behavior change that can happen in the household. Shopping with a list, organizing your fridge effectively, storing your food, understanding food date labels. This is a huge thing that we're trying to focus on at the federal level. So one of the things that Nina talked about just before this is a new grant announced by the EPA that we're really excited about, because what this is going to do is bring together a coalition of entities that are, of other things, going to be focusing on a campaign to reduce food loss and waste, specifically targeted ideally for consumers. And this is something that NRDC has a lot of background in. We have a campaign called Save the Food, and we work with a lot of local city governments to get Save the Food messaging implemented into their programming. So, for example, if a city like New York City or Baltimore are rolling out a composting program, we want to ensure that there's messaging on that composting education program that says, eat your food before you compost it, because that's going to reduce your food. That's going to reduce the load on the city to process that food waste, and it's also going to keep money in the consumer's pocket. So a lot of money is wasted each year on food that isn't eaten, and so not only do we see this as a opportunity to, address methane from landfills, address overworked waste management systems, but we also see it as an opportunity to keep money in consumers' pockets and help it be seen as an inroad to just being a more conscientious consumer.
So it's really interesting that you say that, because as I was doing my homework for today, I looked at the ReFed Food Waste Monitor, and the latest year that they have is for 2022. And great news, food waste was down. Maybe people remember 2022, food inflation was like way up. So it really works. People value their food more because it costs more money and they waste less. But that doesn't really sound like a solution. So what do we do with this? Like, we know that to get people to value their food, you can tell them where it came from, you can, make it taste really good, but ultimately, like, it tends to just come down to price. So what's the policy solution here? Should food prices just stay high? I don't know. I'm really asking.
Yeah, I think in terms of addressing food waste, there's policy interventions that can happen across the food supply chain that are going to incrementally not only change the habit of consumers, but are also going to change the way that business is done. So, for example, Emily was talking a lot about organic waste bans from the landfill. Like, if we are disincentivized to send food into the landfill, then there are going to be new business opportunities for infrastructure, for upcycling of food, making new products from food that is otherwise going to be wasted, and new pathways for things like donation of high quality surplus food. With some of the bans that Emily was talking about, you do see an uptick in food donation, and that's like a really critical component of our food system. Similarly, I think there's other components of education of consumers. I mentioned food date labeling. We, NRDC, along with the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, ReFed, and the World Wildlife Fund came together to build a coalition called the Zero Food Waste Coalition, working at the federal and state level on various policy solutions. We're now over 220 members across all 50 states of people that are working across businesses, institutions, municipalities, states, many more entities to really solve this problem together. And so when you have an issue like food date labeling, all of us are acutely aware of going into our fridge and seeing the milk carton. One person in the household is definitely drinking that milk. The other person in the household is like, no way, it was best if used by yesterday. Spoiler alert, like, a lot of those date labels aren't relevant to you as a consumer. And so what we want to do is make it so that there's standardization at the federal level about this issue, so you have a standardized date label, and then provide consumers with the tools that they need to understand really basic things that are leading to food waste, like the misunderstanding of a date label. Use your senses and properly maintain temperature control on your food. But what we're seeing working in coalition is that we can kind of tackle these issues together so that by the time that it's at the household, people are just more equipped to know how to handle their food.
So it's interesting you mentioned the date label issue because that's been we've been talking about a federal date label legislation for
11 years. And 5 days.
I was going to say since I started reporting on food, but since before that. So it just isn't happening. And as far as I know, I don't know that anybody's really opposing it. It just doesn't seem to get any traction. I know California now might be taking that step on their own. Are you guys optimistic that California likes to do things and then the rest of the country has to just catch up? I think it's cool.
Dina, can I just ask you, like, since we have you all here, why hasn't it passed?
Can I take that first? I'll go first. Okay, let me talk about California for a second, because I think it's super exciting. And like, go California. I know Secretary Ross was out here. This maybe isn't like her wheelhouse, but they do amazing stuff, and it's great. California just was the first state they passed standard date labels. It was passed by both houses. It is sitting on the governor's desk. He has until September 30th to sign it. Anyone who's here right now or watching, like, it is not too late. Send letters. I think part of why it doesn't happen is there's a lack of education about how important this is. And I think it ties back to this national campaign that Maddie was just talking about and that Nana from EPA talked about, that there's a great moment now if we're about to roll out a bunch of consumer education about food waste, like, let's make these clear now, and then you can start telling people, when you see this language, it means smell your food, look at your food. If it looks and smells fine, it's totally fine. And for this food that has this other label, be more cautious, eat it before the date or throw it out when that happens. And so I think there's this like critical window. And it has been a really long time, but this Congress, for the first time since we started working on this issue, there's a lot more co-sponsors for the federal legislation. So in the House of Representatives, there are 41 co-sponsors on a bill to standardize date labels, bipartisan. There's only one sponsor in the Senate, so if you know any senators, let them know to jump on board. But I think it takes a while on these bigger issues, especially if you're trying to go through Congress, because there's a lot of other pressing things that they can't get done. I think this falls to the bottom of that list, but I feel optimistic. And I'll say one other thing from the global work we've been doing with Global Food Banking Network. We've now looked at the laws on food waste in 25 countries, and we're the only country that doesn't have a law standardizing date labels of 25. And that doesn't even include the whole EU, which also has standard across the entire EU. So we're really an outlier in like not taking action on this, but I do feel like with California right now setting the stage, and they separately passed a resolution calling on Congress to do this too. So they're like, we're going to do it if you don't, but we also want you to do something too. So I think I feel optimistic.
I'm going to echo that. I feel optimistic too. I think there's more like movement than there has been previously. And so please do talk about it if you are talking to people.
Great. I talk about it and make people feel bad about themselves all the time.
Yes.
You're a lunch monitor.
Changing consumer behavior.
I want to be a lunch monitor.
Great. So, one thing that we don't talk enough about, I think, when we talk about food waste is how unaffordable food is for so many people. And when we talk about, food waste, and sure, we can donate it instead of throwing it away. Well, that's not really a solution to people not being able to afford food. And I'm wondering what that solution is, and whether there's a solution for the lack of affordability of food that also helps reduce food waste.
Well, it's not just food that's expensive. That's the elastic part of people's budget. It's really the cost of housing, of childcare, the stagnant wages that's causing all of that. So I think, and I'm sure that over the course of this week, there are a lot of panels discussing, why food prices are rising. But I do think, it's the classic, we need to pay people more so that there's more disposable income for food, which is, again, that part of if you have an emergency that's going to take up, money that you don't have anyway, you're going to use less of your money for food. And it's just such a tragedy, especially in light of the federal data that came out 2 weeks ago that show that food insecurity is, of course, continuing to be on the rise. So the fact, just the horrendousness of having such a reality of food waste with food insecurity is, something we have to do better on.
Support your local unions, right? With Baltimore City, there's obviously a really high rate of food insecurity. I do think donated food goes a long way. Today, actually, there's the ribbon cutting at the the first Enoch Pratt free market, which is our library system. And they partner with the Maryland Food Bank, and they are stocking it like a grocery store. So it's like your corner store, but it's absolutely free. You can go in, it's right on the bus station, and get whatever it is that you need, and it's fresh produce. It's also shelf-stable items. But, right now, in the short term, I do think that capturing that, donatable food and redistributing it in like a timely way where it's not going bad, where you have like the cold storage along the way to make sure that that food stays good is a really viable solution. But then also for me, I think about city contracting, right? Like how can I support unionized workplaces through city contracting, or how can I support small local businesses and keep those city dollars local, supporting small composters instead of industrial composters. So, and that puts money back in people's pockets, right? And they can afford the food that is grown locally.
Great. Well, time's up, so thank you guys. And I didn't even get to ask you your worst food waste crime in the last week, because
it's climate.
I'm interviewing Sam Cass later, and I'm going to ask him. So thank you guys so much, and thank you, Food Tank, for having me. Thank you, Danielle.
I want to hear those food waste crimes. Thank you all so much. Another round of applause, everyone. This is a great panel. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge a few more of our in-kind sponsors, including King Arthur Bacon Company. Thank you. Little Sesame, Nature's Find, Nature's Path, Nyman Ranch, Oatly, Parlor Coffee, Raw Foods, Ceremony, Simply, Strong Roots, and Stonyfield. Round of applause for them, please. So in this next conversation, we're going to turn to the impact of pesticide use on pollinators and our food and agriculture systems. And I'd like to introduce our moderator and longtime friend and my other favorite journalist. I misspoke before. I have two favorite journalists, Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food, drink, and agriculture at Forbes. Give her a round of applause. She's my favorite. Joining her, we have Dr. Judy Wu Smart, an associate professor and extension specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome her, please. Dan Rushell, the director of Pollinators and Pesticides and Nature at NRDC. A round of applause, please. Dr. Leslie Rees, who is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Georgetown University. Round of applause. And Dr. Kathy Nolan, the president of Physicians for Social Responsibility in New York. Chloe, my friend, who I love, over to you.
Okay, hello Climate Week. So we're gonna do a lot of bridging the gaps right now, because pollination really is so crucial to honestly everything we've been talking about today. And so this pesticide conversation we're gonna be having, right? Because pesticides are killing our soil, making it harder to have soil health, exist and permeate and showcase that beautiful biodiversity we all need in our food system. And when you actually understand how much pollination, how much we struggle for it, but also how much pollination we need for many of the foods we eat, that food waste stuff becomes even more staggering to me personally. There are so many other inputs you just really don't understand exist. And when we're talking about this, roughly a third of the produce we eat all need pollination. That's everything from carrots and onions to berries, nuts, apples. It's roughly, around the top 100 flowering crops that we have out there, the most popular flowering crops, some 80 of them need pollination. And yields are impacted by a lot of crops, even if they don't require pollination. And so that's also kind of one of these kind of unfortunate ironies here, because the industrial agriculture system, which is hurting pollination from using all these pesticides, soybeans need pollination to increase yield, so is alfalfa, and grass-fed beef producers, and this really all is very intertwined. So I think everyone here is very well aware of what colony collapse is. I'm sure you've at least heard it once. Just to tee us up with one more stat, 150 million acres in this country are sprayed by pesticides. That is serious. It is an astounding amount. And with that, I'd love to have all of these amazing panelists, share why this is important to your work, and particularly why getting pesticides out of our farming is so crucial to the future of food, especially as we think about it, as how we can all survive climate crisis and dignity.
Oh, okay. It's been great to be here. I mean, I think the focus on regenerative ag and soil health has been an incredible discussion and really important focus. But I do think that people have to understand that I caution that the benefits that we see from these impacts are threatened by systemic pesticide pollution. And so there's a lot of issues that we still need to improve on and really kind of think of the permeating factors that are contributing to the decline of the entire system. I'm in Nebraska, where more recently 98% of the unviable, unmarketed pesticide-treated seeds throughout North America was being funneled into our state as disposal through ethanol production. And the practice led to a lot of byproduct waste that was highly contaminated with pesticides and a mixture of these compounds that were then being distributed to farmers as soil conditioners and utilized on their properties without knowledge of those contaminants. And while this is kind of an isolated case in Nebraska, the concerns about and surrounding disposal of treated seeds is really still unclear. It's stopped in our state, but where is it occurring now? And that's still a big kind of concern for us, because the ramifications and the ecological impacts of what we saw happening in our local region was pretty widespreading, from bees to amphibians to birds to the humans that were living in these communities. And so this is not just a pollinator problem. It's a One Health problem, and that really, if you're not familiar with that term, it just basically means that these grand challenges really are the conditions and the environment, the human health and wildlife health are so interconnected that we really shouldn't be looking at it with one lens. We have to be looking at it as a system.
And I can say in our work, so my job, I'm an attorney with NRDC, and I direct our pollinators work. And increasingly, over the years, we've come to focus on pesticides as one of the key driving issues behind pollinator loss, and in particular a class of pesticides known as the neonicotinoids. And this relates to the treated seeds that Judy was talking about. So with the neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, we see one of the most ecologically destructive pesticides since DDT. And there's multiple reasons for that. One, these are some of the most potent insecticides ever created. They've made U.S. agriculture anywhere between 10 and 50 times more harmful to insect life. And the coating, the neonic coating on one seed has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees, just to give you a sense of scale, right? Wow. The second issue with neonics is they're used on an unprecedented scale, right? Up to 150 million acres, probably more nationwide when you can count total use. This is one of the largest deployments of insecticides in U.S. history, and it's happening year after year after year. And then the third issue with neonics, and this was the major innovation with neonics, is that they're systemic insecticides, which means they are designed to permeate plants, to get into the leaves, the pollen, the root, the nectar, and basically to make the plant itself the pesticide. And that allows them to be literally painted on seeds. And the idea is, as that plant is growing, it soaks up the pesticides through its roots and becomes toxic. The problem is only 2 to 5% get into that target plant. The other 95+% stay in the soil. They persist for years and years and years. And those same properties that let the pesticides get into the plant means that anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation for lawn applications, every time you water your lawn, those pesticides are moving through the environment. They're contaminating new soil. If there are plants in that new soil, those plants soak up the pesticides. They become toxic. Their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply, that becomes polluted. And the sum total effect is we now have massive contamination from year-over-year use, toxicity building up in the soil over a huge area and expanding every time it rains into every nook and cranny of our ecosystem, and by the way, our bodies as well. And that's a huge problem. We saw it with pollinators, right? Pollinators were the canary in the coal mine, but there is a much larger hollowing out of biodiversity and threats to our human health that is going on with these pesticides, neonics sort of being the chief among them, but certainly not the only ones.
Yes, and I'll pick up on that. I'm a global change ecologist focused on insects. And, we're talking here about pollinators, but insects actually perform so many different ecosystem services. We were talking earlier about healthy soils, just recycling nutrients into the soil. They're the base of the animal food chain. Insects outweigh all terrestrial vertebrates put together, and that includes people and livestock. So we can't really minimize all the values that insects have, and we've just gotten more and more evidence of this global decline of insects over the past 20 to 50 years. And that's not just very sensitive species and very, conservation associated habitats. It's like the most common species. And one of the things that's really kind of floated to the top are these neonicotinoids. But we also know that it is lots of different factors that interact with each other. We call it death by 1,000 cuts. And so one thing I always like to really stress is that we can't really look at these dynamics and understand them unless we have the data to be able to look at these factors on a very large scale. And they've stopped reporting on neonicotinoid use in the US back in 2015. And so the studies I've done have to stop in 2014. We can't go into the future, but we know the last 10 years have been the hottest on record. So I can't say what's the general relative contribution of climate versus pesticides versus how those interact with each other, because if we don't have the data, we can't know.
But we can know that we can take one of these things out at a time, and we can start with neonics, because everything that everybody has said isn't enough to describe how toxic these chemicals are. Neonicotinoid means new nicotine-like compound. So these are like nicotines that were thought to be able to target insects, but they don't. They kill worms and beetles and everything that would be in healthy soil. So farmers need to be pushing to get these chemicals out of their crops, out of their fields. But instead, they're being encouraged to use them, and to use them prophylactically, which means to put them on the seed and have that in the field when there's no infestation. Now, we've learned in medicine over many years that using antibiotics prophylactically, one, presents more harm to the patient potentially, and two, can breed resistance. Well, the same thing turns out to be true in terms of using these neonics prophylactically. They are more harmful then in their effects as they spread throughout the environment and are consumed by us, and they also can breed resistance to the use of this class of insecticides. Humans can be harmed by these compounds. We know that because they're nicotine-like. And if you expose somebody to nicotine acutely or chronically, it's really bad for you. When these chemicals get into the water and into the food that we eat, they are building up in our bodies. Studies done of pregnant women in the Northeast show that more and more women over time are showing up with positive serum levels for these compounds, and they're higher and higher. And the highest levels are in Hispanic women. Now, we don't know if that's because there's a large number of the farming community that are being measured there, or whether it's a social justice issue. Because if you eat organically, you eat organic food, you are probably going to experience far lower exposures to neonics and other insecticides. And so the community that's showing up high may be being exposed to more food that is conventionally grown and more food that is potentially contaminated from nearby sources. The initial studies that showed wildlife were being impacted were deer out in the West were being reported to the wildlife authorities for having congenital abnormalities and being small and being stillborn, being found by hunters. And studies were done, and in the wild, deer were provided with water that had a neonic in it in increasing doses. And the more of the neonic that they were given, the more likely they were to show exactly those findings.
Wow.
Very similar findings in case control studies in humans. So I am a pediatrician by training. I'm very worried that we have increasing levels of a compound where we know it's toxic and it's building up year over year. If we don't stop, we're going to see the same types of things that those hunters saw.
And not to hop in, but to hop in. The study that Kathy mentioned about pregnant women, hundreds of pregnant women measured across the country. The top line number there is over 95% of them had neonics in their bodies, and again, those levels increasing every year. So this is an issue that, whether you know it or not, affects all of us.
Yeah, Dan, you said the phrase canary in a coal mine earlier. I want to dig into that more, that from a health perspective, but also from a broader climate perspective. What is the most surprising piece of information about this problem that each of you have learned, more recently? I think you're so on the ground here that, I think you've got knowledge to drop on us.
Well, I think we can start with that study. And what is also, what really shocked me was sort of another study that was done in the wild. So after the study Kathy mentioned about the controlled study with deer and neonics, the refrain from industry was, well, you fed these deer a bunch of neonics. This is not what they're really exposed to in the real world. And so the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources went out and they collected spleens from hunters. Imagine 800 deer spleens moving through the mail, right? And then they tested those spleens because that was what the study looked for, neonics in the spleen. And they found in 2019, 2/3 of deer across Minnesota had neonics in their bodies. Didn't matter what environment, rural, urban, they all, about 2/3 with 1/3 at levels associated with birth defects and death in the Burheim study. They did that study 2 years later. Those numbers jumped. Virtually all deer in Minnesota that they tested had neonics in their bodies, with 2/3 at levels associated with birth defects and death in the Burheim study. This study was done just 2 years later. And so, as Leslie mentioned, we don't have very good data on treated seed use, but everything that is indicating, the studies that we have is showing that these are actually building up in our environment, that the problem is actually getting worse. And that study shocked me.
Yeah, there was a study that came out recently where they just went out to nurseries and bought a bunch of, plants that you would plant in your garden, and found that the vast majority of them had neonicotinoids in them. And so, to me, what I think comes out of this is just how much this has penetrated into the environment in a relatively short amount of time. It was in the early 2000s that these seed treatments really came into wide use. And so it's just such a short amount of time. And for me, and I study butterflies just because we have the most data on butterflies than any other insect, You know, even the most common butterflies, the common weedy white butterflies that you guys probably see flying around, you know, New York City, those are all declining too. Like, it's not just, again, the rare species. It's like everything is going down.
There was just a study done and published in the past couple of weeks that is looking at the relationship of cancer to insecticides, and that showed an association. But I'm more concerned with the types of effects that neonics can have on humans because they can be more subtle. So in those case control studies, there were two congenital abnormalities that are both very severe abnormalities: tetralogy of Fallot, which is malformation of the heart, and anencephaly, which is the absence of the growth of the brain, which is a lethal condition. Tetralogy of Fallot can now be treated in many instances. But and the anencephaly makes sense in terms of these being neurotoxic. They also seem to have this developmental impact by being endocrine disruptive compounds, which means they can be potent at very low doses. But the other finding was if increased in neurologic conditions that were on the autism spectrum and hyperactivity. These can be very hard to sort out from all the other kinds of environmental impacts that children can be subjected to, but to see them in populations that are exposed to these chemicals above the baseline, I think we're talking about actually feeding ourselves and our children nicotine. That is not something that if you spent your life trying to get people to stop smoking, that you want to do. And bees, if you offer them a plant that has nicotinoids on it and another plant that doesn't, they will get addicted to the plant that has the neonicotinoids on it. Wow. So why aren't we paying attention?
If they don't die, right? So going back to the canaries in the coal mine, I just wanted to make 2 points that oftentimes we think of bees as being that service. And honeybees are often the ones that we look at as our model system, but they are just a managed livestock species that do not well represent what we have in nature in wild pollinators that tend to be more sensitive and more vulnerable for a number of reasons. But the other counter argument I hear a lot is, well, bee colonies the number of colonies and their loss rate seems to be pretty stable, and so that is not an alarm. And I want people to recognize that the effort that beekeepers put into their operations to combat these losses, they put in time, they put in labor, they put in a lot of effort to recover from those losses. But it comes at a cost. The colonies are becoming less productive. They're becoming less resilient to pests and diseases. They are becoming less resilient and adaptable to extreme weather conditions. So it's not a really good metric to really understand the extent of the issue. So I would just want to emphasize that not only do we need to protect and support the future of farmers, but we also really have to be advocating for beekeepers. They are struggling, and it is often something that is not recognized.
Absolutely. There's actually a crazy consolidation within there's only, a handful of the managed beekeepers out there that actually maintain, 88% plus of all the bees that we need for pollinating all of these plants.
Yes.
It's the most beekeepers are small scale, but the actual most of the plants are only handled by like 2 or 3. Yes. Fascinating stuff. And I think also just to say, we'd be remiss not to say that the consolidation in seed and pesticides is part of the problem here. We were talking about that with soil health. It's also a connection. We don't have too much time, so I want to end on something else, but I want to take like 20, 30 seconds to say there is momentum happening with pesticide use from the policy perspective. Can we give like 15, 20 seconds on what's been happening, but also where the U.S. is still lagging?
Yeah, so it's tough in 15 seconds, but
do your best.
So we know, and this is sort of funny and maybe fortunate, that the largest uses of these pesticides across the country, this is the coatings on corn, soybean, wheat seeds, other field crops, they are not providing economic benefits to farmers. So really the only folks that are benefiting are the chemical companies, which by the way are the same companies that make the seeds, and they give it to a package and often give farmers no choice in terms of whether the pesticide comes on the seed or not. We just had a major breakthrough in New York with the passage of the Birds and Bees Protection Act, a bill we've worked on for years. Yeah, some folks that helped out with that work. And that is the first law in the country that addresses the use of these pesticide-treated seeds, and it does so in a really innovative way, but I don't have time to talk about it.
Well, so there has been momentum, though, in other places.
And, and other states taking action, but we think that the Birds and Bees Protection Act is really sort of the national model for how to deal with the seed issue, which again is the largest and most needless use of these pesticides.
Absolutely.
And unregulated.
And unregulated at the state and federal government.
Yes. Scary stuff. Well, we have no time, but let's all go around and say a call to action. We'd be remiss not to have you amazing people not share a call to action here today.
Yeah, I'm actually going to say that if you filter your water and you buy organic, that you can reduce your exposure to these, and talk to everybody you know to tell them to pass laws like we have here in New York State.
I'm going to say get involved with local nature centers, learn your local biodiversity, and maybe become a citizen scientist working on one of the many monitoring programs, because that's how we get enough data to answer these questions on a large scale.
I'll echo Kathy. I mean, reach out to your elected officials, not just the federal officials, but also your state officials. Because when they get a call from their constituents, they listen and tell them that you want action on this issue. We've found that the popular momentum here is what allowed us to overcome the very powerful opposition from the industry. It matters, hugely matters. Reach out to your elected officials.
Plant more flowers. Go out there and help restore the habitat that's degrading, and give the bees and other pollinators more forage and more habitat. I would say everybody and anybody can do that.
That's an amazing place to end. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Everyone stay in your seat. And I'm going to tell you why. Not you. You can go. We have 3 more amazing conversations with 3 different rock stars. If you go out into that lobby and get rowdy and talk a lot and don't stay in your seats, I'm not going to give you any snacks or beverages. So that you have choices, but I think you should stay here. These combos will be amazing. So sit down and get ready, all right? I'm going to sit down and get ready. I don't like where the podium is. I'm going to say that. Joining me for this conversation is another public servant I greatly admire, and I'll introduce her in a minute, but I want to give some background. The 2022, I'm going to start over. In 2022, the White House held the first conference on hunger, nutrition, and health in more than 50 years. It was a truly historic event. Then, at that time, they released a national strategy to end hunger and improve public health by 2030. And so many of us were so inspired by the White House's work over the last 2 years. And I am so honored, and I've had the chance to sit with this individual many times and have great conversations, but I am so honored to introduce Catherine Okar, the Special Assistant to the President for Public Health and Disparities at the White House. And we've had so many folks from government on stage today, and it's truly been an honor for me because they are public servants, they are serving all of us, and they have done such a good job. Please give Kat a round of applause. What an honor to see you again. Thank you for coming to New York. I know how busy. Nothing's happening in Washington right now.
It's so great to be here. And I mean, I don't know if my colleagues have given you all kudos, but like Food Tank and Danny and Bernie and Elena and Kenzie and the team are just amazing. Like, we all know it, but it's just like you guys just put on such great events and just keep the momentum going on so many issues. So it is just an honor for me to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kat. I want to go back to the national strategy, and I'd love for you to tell us about some of the progress we've made since 2022, because it's kind of incredible.
Well, thanks. So it's crazy because it was almost 2 years to the day. So 2 years is on Saturday, the 28th of September is our 2-year anniversary, which is crazy to think because it was such a momentous day and week. And since then, it has been really quite historic what we've seen happen. So for those of you who are not super intimately familiar with the conference and the strategy, as Danny said, it was the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. And then we also put out a federal strategy that was focused on ending hunger and reducing diet-related disease. but also with reducing disparities, because we know, everyone in this room knows, diseases, diet-related disease, hunger, food insecurity, they do not touch communities in the same exact way. And so there's so many underserved communities that continually face these issues. And if you look at the country, in many ways, we're not going in the right direction. We're not seeing obesity and overweight rates go down. We're seeing them go up in many communities. And so there's a lot of work to do. And so when we talk about the progress that's been made, which has really been super exciting, because when we were thinking about the conference and we were thinking about the strategy, we knew that we had to be what we call whole of government. We had to think about whole of society and how everybody can play a role. And so we thought about, how do we improve food access and affordability? How do we integrate nutrition and health into, so that they're not, oh, we're just thinking about nutrition and we're just thinking about medical care, we're integrating them. How are we thinking about making environments more consumer friendly, so that it's not hard to eat healthy and sustainable food? It's easier to eat healthier and sustainable food. And then of course we're thinking about, how do we increase physical activity and how do we increase research on these issues? And so some of the things that we've seen that have been really quite amazing, whether it's legislatively or administratively, we made permanent summer EBT, which basically puts more money in families' pockets so that they can afford groceries during the summer, because we know so many kids eat their meals at school, and then when they're home for the summer, they don't have enough food to eat. So everything from thinking about how kids eat, but then also we really galvanized a food as medicine movement. And I have to say, that's like one of the most exciting parts of the conference, because we're continuing to see food as medicine talked about. And what that means is, how do we ensure that when you're in the doctor's office, they're not just saying, just checking your vitals, but they're asking you and thinking about, look, that person might not have enough food to eat. That person might not know or be able to get nutritious food. And so we've really seen that take off. But then we've also just recently put out a national strategy on food loss and food waste and recycling organics. And so we're thinking about how we increase affordability, increase access, by ensuring that food doesn't go to waste, because as we have been talking about all day, so much goes to waste and it doesn't need to. But then we're also thinking about, of course, research investments. So especially on the food waste side, thinking of, and food loss side, what packaging can be created so that food lasts longer? How do we better message to consumers about what a food date label means? And I know you were talking about this a couple panels ago, but how do you ensure that people know that food doesn't necessarily need to be wasted, maybe isn't necessarily bad, and how do you make sure that that trickles down all the way to local communities? So I could go on, and I know there's more questions, but there's so much has happened, but there's still so much to do.
Yeah, and it's so robust. And what has impressed me a lot, Kat, is this whole of government approach. It's not just something in theory. I mean, we've had USDA and EPA here today on stage, but it's not just theory, it's happening in practice. What does that look like when you're coordinating all of these different folks from different federal agencies?
Well, it's a little bit like being a translator, because if you think about federal agencies, and I know the federal government alone speaks its own language, but every federal agency kind of has its own language. And so the National Strategy on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health had 20 federal agencies as part of that. 20 federal agencies. And I know some people don't even know that there are 20 federal agencies, but there are. And so if you think about, of course, the Department of Health and Human Services, U.S. Department of Agriculture, EPA, but also think about how food and nutrition and physical activity plays a role in the Department of Defense or Veterans Affairs, or how we think about housing and urban development, or even the Department of Transportation, because we know transportation plays a role in all of these issues. And so when we had to be thinking about, everybody has a role to play, and everybody can have policies that make an impact, programs that make an impact. And so, even on our food loss and waste strategy, that is across government as well. That was spearheaded by the USDA, the EPA, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And so we're really trying to break down those silos, because believe it or not, government can be a smidge siloed, but we're really trying to make sure that we're rowing in the same direction. And even one of the things, just to think about it from an operational perspective, is one of the things in our strategy was having all federal agencies implement the federal food service guidelines. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those, these are put out by the CDC, and they really are recommendations and guidelines for how you can include nutritious, sustainable food in your cafeterias and in your vending machines, and how you can think about more efficient operations in your, in a federal cafeteria, for example. And so stay tuned for some like exciting updates tomorrow. If you're not here and enjoying Climate Week, we have a stakeholder call at 3:30, or we'll have more information to share. But that's kind of one of the ways that we're really trying to operationalize all of these goals, because I think we recognize that sometimes we just say like, let's end hunger, let's reduce diet-related disease, let's make things more affordable. But it can be hard to figure out what that means. And so we're really trying to operationalize it, especially for federal employees, because they're one of, if not the largest employer across the country. And then of course, and I know we're going to talk about this, the private sector has such a huge role to play.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. She mentioned those stakeholder calls. They are not boring. They're never boring. And I want you to be on them, because I always get excited, and it's cool to hear from so many different people and be part of the process of democracy, which I think we forget. We are all part of this. We are all citizens, and we are all citizen eaters. And if we care about food, we need to be involved in these processes.
Absolutely. And we really try our best to open up the quasi black box that I know that the government sometimes can be, to say like, this is what we're doing. And then we take questions as well. And if there's exciting information that you have to share, we want to know about it. If you have questions and we don't have the answers, we want to know, and we want to circle back with you. So really encourage you. It's like a way to stay updated on all the stuff that we're doing to further the goals of the strategy from the federal side. And then often we will touch on a little bit what some of our private sector partners are doing as well.
Kat, you mentioned the private sector. There's so many roles for researchers and other policymakers, civil society organizations to make. How do you see them continuing to be involved in the strategy?
I mean, they are hands down essential. I think, we often talk about the government as such a important player in this work, but without academia, without research, without the private sector, whether it's companies, whether it's investors, big or small, we can't do anything. We all have to be rowing in the same direction. And so that's one of the reasons why we're so proud of the $10 billion we got in external commitments when we did the strategy and we did the conference. And then we put out another call to action, because we recognize that the federal government, even though we have so many levers, we don't have every lever. And from the biggest company to the smallest community-based organization, everyone has a role to play. And so one of the particularly relevant commitments for this conversation is the Just One project launched what's called the Food Rescue Alliance, and they are recovering hundreds of thousands of pounds of food from the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. Nice. And so if you think about how much food is used and consumed in a place like the Venetian, that is a potentially huge impact. And then they will be distributing it to a number of underserved communities. And so when we think about this, we think about how it can't just be the nonprofits of the world. It can't just be government. It has to be businesses too. And one of the best commitments we got from the conference too was $2.5 billion in private investment from venture capitalists, saying we're going to think about products and companies and invest in those companies that are talking the talk and walking the walk, and thinking about and investing in companies that are going to move the needle on healthy food and food insecurity. And so that's kind of the breadth of commitments that we need to actually make a difference.
And it's been impressive, again, that those venture capitalists are investing in different kinds of people running different kinds of companies that we haven't heard from before. Black and brown folks, women entrepreneurs, folks from the non-binary community, people who have all this experience and entrepreneurial spirit, and they're being invested in. Finally, it's so great. So can you talk about some of the key issues that you're looking at in the national strategy right now?
Sure. I mean, so many. I think, especially as we, in the coming months, we're really trying to focus on getting out a number of rules from the Food and Drug Administration. So we committed to, in the national strategy, putting out a rule related to front of pack labeling. So a number of other countries do this. We're one of the only countries that doesn't do this. A label that says if a product is high in sugar or high in added fat, or high in fat, high in added sugar, high in sodium, so that when you're scanning, because everybody doesn't have 5 hours to spend in the grocery store, and food labels can be confusing, that you can just quickly scan and say like, oh, okay, that product's a little bit better than that product, and make a decision. And so that's one of the things that we committed to in the national strategy, which could be hugely transformative if you think about it, and not only for the consumer, but for food companies too, in terms of what they're thinking about in terms of what's in their products. But I also think, and as we've talked about so much today, there's so much work to do. And I think as thinking about how we educate each other, when you think about behavior change, especially relevant to this panel, food loss and educating on the importance of pollinators and soils, it really has to start with our kids. And so, knowing that kids know where their food comes from, or helping them realize that and putting those options in front of them and helping them be engaged, that they just don't think that their food just comes from a grocery aisle, but there is somebody who actually cultivated it, is so important. But I also think, understanding, making sure that kids also, I as a nod to my own parents, we very much grew up with, there are starving children. You are not going to leave food on the table. And I think that has to, in some ways, there are starving children in this country and in other countries, and really recognizing and making sure that it's not just the parents, but the schools, the churches, the community centers that are really embodying these messages, whether it's food loss and waste, whether it's understanding and educating kids where their food comes from. And we have a number of programs at the federal government, but it also takes each one of us to do that in our daily lives.
Yeah. It's a whole of society approach for
society.
real. We are sadly out of time. It was so great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Please-
Danny. So
please
appreciate
give
it.
Kat a round of applause. You're free to leave. Thank you so much. So we have another really special fireside chat coming up. Again, please stay. We're going to have fun afterwards. There's food and drink. Don't leave. The reception's going to be great. I need to thank some other of our in-kind partners, including Tyndall, Tony's Chocolonely, Traditional Medicinals, Vital Farms, Whole Chain, and Wonder and Blue Apron. So now I get to welcome back my other favorite journalist, Dina Schenker, to the stage. She's with Bloomberg, and she is going to sit down with Sam Cass, who has worn many, many hats. He's been a chef in the White House. He's been the senior policy advisor for nutrition policy for President Obama. He is an author, a strategist, an investor, the founder of Trove. I could go on, but I'm going to let Dina and Sam take it over. Thank you both so much. Hey, hey.
Thank you so much. Sam, good to be here with you. Thought we'd start with a fun little icebreaker, which is your last personal food waste failure.
Oh my God. First of all, hi everybody. How's it going? I didn't know she was going to ask me that. I mean, what's ironic is, I'm an official United Nations 12.3 food waste champion, and man, I feel like I more frequently than I should violate my own identity. Last night I threw away, some potatoes and a couple pieces of rotisserie chicken that just got stuck in the back.
Yeah.
I'm going to admit it. It's sad, but it's true.
Yeah, it feels bad every time, right?
Every time, and I really have this I have a conversation out loud with myself. I'm like, man, this is really bad. You really got to get your shit.
Yeah, I know that feeling. So thank you for sharing. Food waste is an issue that, everyone agrees is a problem. We don't have a pro-food waste lobby. There's been lots of solutions presented because the problem shows up in so many different ways. You have been in the political world, you've been in the corporate world, you are, as we just found out, a human being with your own kitchen. So why is this problem so hard to fix? Where do you see where's the friction? Is it all of the above, and why?
It didn't contest. I was like, do not make me talk about food waste anymore. I can't talk about it anymore. We gotta stop. It's just one of these issues that, like, what else is there to say? I mean, we've been talking about it for so long. It's so obvious. It is, like, as everyone says, the most obvious low-hanging fruit that we've done all the hard part of, like, getting the soil and the water and the fertilizer and growing the food and transporting and processing it and transporting it again and all the things. And, in the United States, this issue plays out very differently, obviously, depending on where you are in the world. And I think the fundamental problem, for us in the U.S. is we're rich. And because of our wealth, we don't value food in the way that somebody who, is more resource constraint does. And I think we have fundamentally a cultural problem, as we do with, so much of the issues that you've heard about today. I would argue are not just, really mostly business problems or political problems, or really cultural problems that manifest themselves in our politics and our business. And food waste is certainly, a shining star of that. I think there's definitely things we can do to design our lives in ways that make it, easier to waste less food. Like, our refrigerators are like where food goes to die. Like, that vegetable bin is like the worst thing for, it's death for vegetables. Mm-hmm. We all have experienced it. And, like, if you can't see it, you're not going to eat it. And that's true. And that's why marketing works. It's a fundamental truth to, like, why we consume what we consume. But it also plays out from food waste. So I think there's design strategies, there's cultural things that we need to just shift. And, this is just one where we all have to see whatever role we're playing, and retailers do some. The reality is manufacturers actually they're pretty efficient. They're not throwing away very much. We have problems on farm, labor challenges, technology challenges, but we all have to just take our source of the waste and just decide we're going to do a better job on it.
When you talk to chefs who run restaurant kitchens, whether it's a small kitchen or a chain or whatever it is, and you bring this up to them, and these are businesses, the more money that goes into the more food that goes into the garbage, the more money that goes into the garbage. Do you find that this is an issue that they're already thinking about and looking to solve? Do you find that they want to solve it, but it really takes a rethinking of their entire menu and how they run their kitchen? Or is this just like, dude, I am trying to, get dinner on the table and serve customers. I can't even think about this right now.
I think depending on all of the above, depending on who you're talking to. I mean, look, chefs are really good at making money out of nothing, right? So many dishes we eat are actually like, French toast is just bread that was going to otherwise get thrown away. Like, there's a million examples of food that is figuring out how to use old product or product that would otherwise get wasted and repurposed, and it's just cash. So I think chefs often are quite creative in that regard. And there's most chefs have some story of their chef taking the garbage can and like dumping it on the counter and being like, what the hell is going on? This is all like my profit here, and getting hardcore on their kitchen. I think like where there's a lot more like structural challenge is particularly around more institutional food service operations, hotels. Like buffets are like a disaster for food waste, but there's this expectation that we have culturally that it's like all you can eat, and if it's all you can eat, that means you got to have like it full all the time. And there's not an expectation that you can run out of the sausage. In fact, like I want to make sure I can eat as much sausage as possible. And so if that's the mentality, then there's just a really big source of waste. So I think it plays out in kind of nuanced ways. But both the idea of portion size, which is obviously a disaster ecologically for our health and for food waste. But like, name the last time if you're running a company, like you think it's a good campaign, we're going to give you less for the same price. Like, that's not a winner, trust me. So, like, we have expectations now of what we expect to be on our plates or what we expect the buffet to look like. And it's companies who are really committed to trying to unwind this are having a tough time. There's good money for them because they're just throwing money out the door. But even for the ones who see it, the economic benefit and are really committed to this issue, have a really tough time unwinding this one. Like, they're struggling with it because consumers are like, no, I want my giant heaping portion of whatever.
When you were at the White House, the Obama administration did more for food than I think many of us have. I mean, the most, right? I haven't done the math.
I would argue.
I haven't done the math, but I mean, it was the first time that food was like a national, like serving healthy meals in schools was, revolutionary and all of these things. We talked about how you brought the pollinators issue to the fore. Did food waste come up, and did it factor in when you guys were planning like a state dinner or something or another event?
I had the awakening on the issue along with, I think, the country. A lot of it rooted in the Refed first report. Dan Barber also had a big impact on me when he's then coming off of that, set up his, pop-up, little restaurant serving all the waste things. And that, I think, before that, no, honestly, I wasn't conscious of it at all. It was just, we didn't have the numbers. Like, I don't think anybody had the perspective on just how much we were throwing away. And so, yeah, no, I was definitely, kind of woke up with at least what felt to me like, I mean, certainly there's plenty of people who were on this before that, but it was not at the top of the agenda from literally any advocate, any nonprofit. Nobody I ever talked to ever really was raising it with me. And it definitely was an awakening. In fact, Dan and I, probably the craziest meal I've ever been a part of, which is saying something at this point. Dan and I did we did his food waste lunch for like 40 heads of state at the UN ahead of COP 2021. So the head of the UN sort of gathered all these presidents to try to kind of start to organize them to make their commitments. And it was like all of them, Xi Jinping and Hollande and Merkel, like all of them were there. And we served them like a bunch of stuff from the trash. It was insane. Like, I was super jazzed. I was like feeling myself like, this is incredible. So I don't know how I got us in this one, but it's gonna be great. And then the night before, I was like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, I'm going to serve these, like, the most powerful, and they never actually had a lunch with all the leaders in one space.
I guess you gave them something to talk about.
Yeah, and it did. Like, so, but it's interesting, the impact of a meal. So like Christine Lagarde, who was also in there, and then she's actually an amazing powerhouse of a woman. And I would see her random things like years later. She's like, "Do you remember that?" And I was like, "Yeah, I remember that." So it does stick with people. But so I think there was a real awakening on the issue for all of us.
What do you think it would take to see it become a national political issue? I mean, even as I ask the question, it feels so distant and impossible.
Do you want my honest answer? I'm at the point where I can't not just be totally blunt. I don't think it's going to be. And I don't think like I think policy has an extraordinarily important role to play in many parts of transforming food. It is, I think, almost always overstated in terms of what it can do. We have this very nice and very neat narrative laid out by friends of mine who I have a lot of respect for. They basically say government and their subsidies are the ones that have made the food system what it is and destroying everything, and they collude with big business and therefore everything's bad, and if we only shifted those subsidies then everything would be fine. And it's like it's entirely untrue, unfortunately. It has no basis in actual fact. And it like leads us to think that there's a policy of the magic wand that can just solve this. And there's a boogeyman, there's good versus evil and boogeyman. It's like so much more complicated and nuanced than that. And there's some parts of truth to that. And there are some really horrible actors that I have scars from. And I think but I think so much more is much more deeply rooted in who we are, what we value as a culture. And that's the hard work. That's the slow work. That's the work that's harder to measure. And that underpins the change. And so, like, for food waste, is there a policy, like, sell-by dates? really important policy that would move the needle on this issue, for sure. So it's not to say that policy isn't really, like smart, good policy isn't really important, but like sell by date is not why I threw out that chicken last night, right? It's because I wasn't, like, I'm busy, I got too much stuff going on, I'm tired, fell asleep on the couch back there, like, you know, and we're all grappling with a lot, we're all dealing with a lot, and, you know, our lives are not designed in such a ways, and we aren't valuing these issues in such a way that are leading us to make different choices sort of as a society. And so I think, like, so policy, yes, but I don't think there's going to be a big political movement on this for a bunch of reasons. But I do think we can make a ton of progress, and I do think it's like the issue that is in some ways the easiest to make progress on, because, like, yeah, there's nobody fighting against this,
Right.
right? Which is like, that's helpful. And everybody wins. Like, everybody saves money. You know, the environment's better. We can get more food to people who really need it. For some of the more institutional sources of waste that, like, you could get, you know, people who don't have enough. And obviously there's a lot of people, and particularly kids in this country, don't have enough food. So, yeah, it's sort of a win-win all around, which is why you sort of get like, why are we still talking about it? Like, I can't believe we're still sitting here talking about this yet again.
What have you seen as the most successful, like, not just whether a policy, whether it's political, but also like corporate or institutional, or even change in your own home behavior? Like, what do you...
From a food waste standpoint?
Yeah.
You know, probably the one that I think has probably moved the lever that I'm aware of, and I'm not like, there's people way smarter and more knowledgeable on the details of this. So I'm sure there's things that are bigger. Compass, the biggest food service company in the world by a lot, by the way, started measuring. They just started measuring the amount of waste. They're very aggressive on this issue, and I got to give them a lot of credit. And they just started measuring what they wasted, and I don't remember the number, so do not hold me to this, but it was like some dramatic cut, like 40%. They reduced it, like basically overnight, just by measuring it and raising the consciousness amongst their cooks, like all across the country and really and globally. Like, you just had to pay attention to this, and people were like, oh man, like, wow, like, we didn't realize what we were throwing away, and it just dropped dramatically. And so, you know, little things like that can have a really big impact. And if we're not aware, then, you know, it's very hard to take action.
Yeah, measuring, definitely. I mean, you can't fix a problem if you can't measure it. Then how do you know how much work you have to do? Yeah. All right, now I'm going to ask you a question because we don't have too much time left, and I'm really personally interested in your answer, and probably other people in this room are too. But how has your approach to reducing food waste in your home changed once you had kids? Because I think kids really, like, I love them, but but it's very difficult to have enough food that your kids want to eat and not too much food that ends up in the garbage because your kids refuse to eat it.
They are not helpful on this issue, like, at all. You know, you try. So my little guy, he's 5. He's a very interesting kid. He's deeply passionate about. He won't basically. I mean, he's jacked, but he refuses to eat any kind of animal protein, essentially. And I basically try to not eat red meat, but I serve plenty of meat in my house and fish, and he just will not eat it. When we go, my older one is super passionate about fishing, so we go fishing. He will throw all the fish back, and he's like, my older one was like, he caught a nice bluefish. He was like, I love you, little fish, and my little guy Ralph was like, don't tell it you love it if you're gonna eat it. Like, okay. So he's very passionate about the animals and the natural environment. We have a big garden. He's very engaged in the garden. He cares about the bugs and the worms and the bees and everything. But he's really tough on eating, and he'll even things that he tends to like, sometimes he's like, I'm just not gonna eat that. And so the only way I made progress with him was like, but you know, let me explain to you, like, that tofu that you're not going to eat tonight, you know, let me tell you where it comes from and all the things and the impact on the environment. And, you know, if you care about the bees, then you're going to, you know, so I'm like, I'm stretching here, people. It's hard because, you know, they're just, you know, sometimes they're hungry, sometimes they're not, but you got to make sure you got food for them. So I can't say that they have helped my if I would be keeping data, which I probably should in my own home, it would definitely have gone up since I've had kids.
When I pack their lunches and then I like take them home,
Oh,
and
forget about lunch.
it's like, oh, those beautiful farmers market
Yeah.
strawberries right into
Yeah,
the compost.
exactly. Yeah,
'cause
exactly.
They've been
It's rough.
sitting in your backpack all weekend.
Yeah.
Also, I'll just say that my daughter also doesn't like animal products. She says she is a vegetarian, except for schnitzel. So she makes it.
There you go. Nice. That's good. I respect that. That's reasonable.
Well, thank you so much. I think food waste is really something that we are all trying, and it's really helpful to hear that even Sam Cass sometimes has to throw some chicken away because it's really, really difficult.
It's sad but true.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much.
I'm going to go behind here. Thank you. More applause, please. There you go. It's confusing. It's a maze up here. I am so glad to be sitting down with this wonderful human being. So I am with Manish Bapna, the president of NRDC, who made this all possible today. Please give him a round of applause. This has been such an incredible collaboration. I have to commend you on your staff, your team, all wonderful, all so committed, all so passionate. These are determined individuals that you worked with. They want to save the world, and they're doing it.
So that reminds me of this quote that Gandhi once said. He said, there are two types of people in the world, those who do the work and those who take the credit. Try to be in the first group. There's a lot less competition there. And so I just want to ask my colleagues who did help make that happen, both in Food Tank and at NRDC, to maybe raise their hands so we can actually provide some recognition for those that actually did do the work.
Wonderful human beings, so easy to work with. Thank you for that. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit, and we didn't have a chance to do this earlier today, about NRDC's goals overall, because you do so many things and do them so well.
So I think that we at NRDC, not dissimilar to a lot in the broader environmental movement, we're at this incredible kind of inflection point in terms of the planet, right? We've seen this unprecedented economic growth if you look at the last century, right? And there's been some good things about that growth, absolutely, right? But it has been designed in a way that has been deeply incompatible with the environmental values that and the social justice values that we care about. And so I see kind of three profound crises that we as a society are grappling with. We're grappling with the climate crisis, we're grappling with the biodiversity crisis, and we're grappling with kind of a pollution or a human health crisis. And these are three overlapping crises. And I think the trick here, or the challenge, is how do we think about placing our efforts and our investments on those issues that can actually tackle multiple things? And that is what makes the focus on the food system so profound and fundamental. It would be difficult to think of a single bigger place to make an effort that could actually address all three of these crises at the same time. And that's why, both in terms of how we see the world and our role and the central importance of food, this is the moment.
It is the moment. It is the moment. And I wonder, from your perspective, as someone who's been thinking about the climate crisis for so long, are you energized right now from what you've seen this week and what you've heard? I know it's only Wednesday. We have a couple more days.
So today actually is a important day. Does anyone know what happened on this day 9 years ago? About, I don't know, maybe 3 miles from where we're sitting. The Sustainable Development Goals were actually endorsed by the UN General Assembly 9 years ago on this day, right? And then we had the Paris Agreement a couple short months later. And there was an incredible optimism globally, right? This was a time of cooperation. It was, we had a exciting person in the White House, but there were real tailwinds supporting international cooperation, eradicating poverty, tackling the climate crisis, finding the financing to do this, right? And here we are 9 years after, and it has been a bumpy road. There's been COVID and a set of pandemics. There's been incredible conflict. We have much more authoritarian governments in large parts of the world. So there's some real headwinds. And it is in that context, I think, that we have to see kind of where we are today. And a part of the challenge that I think we have in this climate week at this moment is how do we kind of reimagine and re-inspire the world that a better future is possible, right? That we can tackle these issues. The good thing is there are some incredible proof points all around the world about what is working, but it's not happening at the scale or the scope that we need to see. And that's so how am I feeling today? It is, I think we're at an inflection point. I think the next couple of years are going to matter. Are we going to be able to build, even in this country, are we going to be able to build from the momentum that we've seen in the last couple of years and take that forward? Or are we going to have to, play defense and kind of stop kind of steps backward? And what's playing out in the United States is playing out globally. So this is a moment for those of us who have voice and reach to speak out, to galvanize, and to demand that we can't go back. A better future is possible.
It really is possible, and that the idea of reimagining, re-inspiring ourselves, that takes incredible storytelling, and I think NRDC has been very good at that, combining anecdotes with numbers on so many different issues. That's important to you, I imagine.
So, we had this, we had an event with John Podesta, who you all know, about 2 months ago. And we asked him, and he's been in and out of government and in and out of our world for many, many decades. And I asked him, it was kind of a fireside chat like this. What has the climate movement, the environmental movement, what don't we have right? And he said that we have to find new ways to cut through the noise and get our message out to the public, right? Remember the Abraham Lincoln famous quote, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So we absolutely need to be thinking about that. If you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Why did, we celebrated getting that policy over, but were we ready to win the win? To tell the stories, to show the proof points that could build and broaden public support? We know that 75% of those investments in the Inflation Reduction Act are going to red states and red districts. It should be the perfect opportunity to broaden, to begin to depoliticize. We're doing some of it. We got to do better. One of the things NRDC is doing on this, aside from the incredible work that my team is doing, is we have a big engagement with Hollywood, something called Rewrite the Future. We have a set of specialists on climate, on the environment, on food, that are working with screenwriters and producers around how you actually get these issues into TVs and movies. Who here watches Ted Lasso? Anyone? Do you remember the, sorry, I don't mean to spoil anything. I haven't, we're still in the middle way through the penultimate season, but there was this incredible story about one of the soccer players who's from Nigeria. And they talked about what was happening with an oil and gas company in the Delta in Nigeria, right? Without getting into Shell and the Niger, right? And how he was devastated by it, and how the team came around him to support him. A very simple story like that can reach audiences and get people to think differently. And so we've been spending a lot of time, not just the dystopian, end of the earth thing, but how do we more subtly, right, implicitly start to get people to think about these things? How do we get people to think about not wasting food? How do we get to people to think about shifting diets, right? And getting that implicit into TVs and movies is another way to reshape norms
Yeah.
in ways that can actually move us forward.
Pop culture is so powerful. And I think a lot of us as environmentalists or as food and agriculture advocates have dismissed that. And it's time that we just take it in and bring it on.
And the beauty about food is everyone eats. Well, we need more people to
Eat more, yep.
But in this country, there is a way to reach everyone in a way that no other part of the climate, pollution, nature crises actually does reach.
Yeah.
And so this is an incredible opportunity to think about how we can use food and ways in which to reach the public to reimagine the types of norms we need to reimagine a food system that is truly compatible with human health, with protecting nature, with tackling climate, right?
And that opportunity that you mentioned is something we've been hearing all day, and I think that's what's so exciting about these issues. And NRDC, from my perspective, has such a tremendous ability because you're big, and you have this tremendous ability to communicate, advocate, even litigate. And as an environmental organization, taking on food is not always easy. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about why it was important for you to take on the poly crisis that you mentioned before, but also these food and climate and food loss and food waste and pollinator issues.
So I don't, when you talk about, most of the environmental movement, I think, historically is focused on the energy system, right? A lot of it was about stopping fossil, which we absolutely need to do. A lot of it is now about building clean, incredibly important, but there hasn't been that much attention really given to food as a system and all the different ways in which reimagining the food system actually is fundamentally about who we are in terms of the values of an environmental organization and the values of the environmental movement, right? And there is, I think, in the last 5 years, an increasing recognition that food, very simple statistic, globally, food accounts for roughly a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, direct and indirect. You cannot solve the climate crisis without tackling food. Food is the single biggest driver for the biodiversity crisis. And you heard earlier today so many statistics about food and human health. We have to make it central to who we are as an organization, as a movement. And the thing that's exciting about food is it does allow us to, to connect in ways that that can be, the current rate. We have to feed a growing population, tackle hunger, tackle obesity, without trashing the planet in the process. This is a collision course we're on. So it is not an overstatement to say this has to be as central as reimagining the energy system. And these are the two jobs, I think, that we have as an environmental movement.
Yeah, I love that you keep using the word reimagining. I wonder for this audience, and remember there are people watching online, do you have a call to action? What would you like them to do? What do you want them to come away with from this day?
I think we are, I've been coming to Climate Week. Climate Week started in 2009. I think there were a few hundred people. And now it's like, it's incredible what it's become. It's only been in the last few years where food has become increasingly more part of the conversation. With COP, not the one in Baku, but the one in Belém, food and nature, there's going to be a moment here where there's going to be a potential opportunity to really bring food globally and nationally, into the mainstream conversation. And so I think a part of the challenge for us is really how to use the kind of global attention, the political, the economic attention, to make food be a fundamental part of what we as a community need to be able to tackle. And the beauty of that is, I think what we heard earlier today are all these incredible proofs of concept of what can be done right. The Birds and Bees Protection Act in New York. I heard earlier today people talked about the Date Labeling Act in California that is sitting on Newsom's desk that he's going to have to sign in the next couple of days. Right? There are some proof points. There's some increasing momentum. And the call is, how do we take advantage of the next 12, 18 months to truly make this unstoppable?
Right. Thank you so much. The moment is now. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for partnering with us. Thanks for this wonderful day. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to take a few moments. A big thanks to WNYC. They've made this flawless. They're wonderful. Thank you so much. I have to thank our colleagues at NRDC for doing such incredible work. Please give them a round of applause. My food tank team, my co-founder Bernard Pollock, this cannot happen without him. He just makes everything easy. Kenzie Wade, Elena Seeley, Jessica Levy, and Jared Kaufman, they've been working behind the scenes tirelessly. Please give them a round of applause. We have great volunteers, Annie Rubin, Wania Ahmed, and Jillian Feinglass. Round of applause. And thanks to everyone who joined us in person and online. We are so thrilled to have this opportunity to communicate with you all. For everyone who is here in person, we have this wonderful reception. So please enjoy, eat, drink, and be merry. Thank you all again. I'm so thrilled that you were all here.